Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. I've been a gem cutter for over 20 years, and I thought I had seen it all. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, each with their own unique challenges. But this stone was something else entirely. It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning in my workshop. I had just finished working on a particularly finicky piece, and was looking forward to a well-deserved break when the door swung open. In walked an old man, his clothes tattered and his eyes wild. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I need you to cut this," he said, his voice trembling as he placed a small, worn-out pouch on my workbench. When I opened the pouch, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a stone unlike anything I had ever seen. It was about the size of a large egg, and it shimmered with colors I couldn't even name. The hues seemed to dance and shift, almost like they were alive. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed against its surface, I felt a slight warmth, like it was pulsing with a faint heartbeat. "What is this?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away. "It's a rare find," the old man muttered, his gaze shifting nervously around the room. "I can't keep it. It's yours now." Before I could ask any more questions, he turned and fled from my workshop, the door slamming shut behind him. I stood there, staring at the strange stone, my mind racing with curiosity and, I admit, a bit of fear. I decided to examine it more closely. As I held it under the magnifying lamp, the stone's colors seemed to grow even more vibrant, swirling in patterns that made my head spin if I looked too long. But it wasn't just its appearance that was odd. There was a supple, sweet scent emanating from it, something like a mix of honey and roses. It was faint but intoxicating, drawing me in deeper. I tried to focus, shaking off the strange sensation and reaching for my tools. I positioned the stone carefully, aiming to make the first incision. The moment the blade touched the surface, a thin crack appeared, spiderwebbing across the stone's face. A small puff of that sweet scent escaped from the crack, filling the air around me. I pulled back, startled. The scent was stronger now, almost overwhelming. It lingered in the back of my throat, making me feel dizzy. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, shaking my head to clear it. I took a deep breath and tried again, but the same thing happened. Every time the blade made contact, the stone cracked slightly, releasing more of that scent. It was as if the stone was resisting, refusing to be cut. I've never seen anything like it in all my years. It was almost alive. Days passed, and I found myself becoming more and more obsessed with the stone. I stayed late at the workshop, trying different techniques, but nothing worked. It was as if the stone was playing a game with me, cracking just enough to taunt me, but never breaking apart. I started dreaming about it too. In my dreams, the stone would grow larger and larger until it filled the entire room, the colors swirling and blending until they formed a face that watched me, its eyes filled with something between amusement and malice. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the scent of honey and roses still clinging to the air. One night, after yet another failed attempt to cut the stone, I sat back in my chair, exhausted. The room seemed to spin around me, and I realized that the scent had grown stronger, almost suffocating. I glanced at the stone, and for a moment, I could swear that it was glowing. "Enough of this," I whispered, my voice shaking. I grabbed the stone and threw it into a drawer, slamming it shut. I needed to get out, get some air. As I stumbled out of the workshop, I felt the cool night breeze on my face, but it did little to clear my head. The scent was still there, lingering in my nostrils, clinging to my clothes. I walked aimlessly through the empty streets, my mind a haze of confusion and fear. I found myself at the old man's house, the one who had brought me the stone. I don't know why I went there. Maybe I thought he could help me, explain what was happening. But when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me like a wall. The same sweet, suffocating scent that had filled my workshop. It was everywhere, so thick I could barely breathe. And there, in the middle of the room, lay the old man, his eyes wide open, his face twisted in a grimace of terror. In his hand, he clutched a shard of the stone, the same cracks running through it as the one in my workshop. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get away, get rid of the stone. I ran back to the workshop, not even sure what I was doing. I threw open the drawer, grabbed the stone, and without thinking, I hurled it to the ground. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, each one releasing that sweet, cloying scent. The scent grew stronger and stronger, filling the room until I could barely see, barely breathe. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my vision blurring. I don't know how long I lay there, struggling to stay conscious. When I finally managed to open my eyes, the room was empty. The stone was gone, every last shard, as if it had never been there. But the scent remained, clinging to the walls, to my skin. It was inside me, filling my lungs, my mind. I staggered to my feet, desperate to escape, but as I reached the door, I saw it. My reflection in the glass, distorted and twisted, the colors from the stone swirling in my eyes. I stumbled back, a scream catching in my throat. My skin was changing, shifting, the colors spreading like a stain. I tried to tear at my skin to stop it, but it was no use. The colors spread, covering me, consuming me. I don't know what I am anymore. I can't leave the workshop. The scent keeps me here, trapped, bound to the stone that no longer exists. I've become a part of it, or maybe it's become a part of me. The colors swirl in my eyes, the scent fills my lungs, and all I can do is wait. Wait for the next poor soul who comes looking for a stone that shimmers with colors they've never seen. I remember the first time I came across that boulder. It was a cool autumn morning, the kind where the air was crisp and the sun barely peeked through the clouds. I was on my usual climbing route, the one I took whenever I needed to clear my head. The trail led me through a dense forest and up a steep incline, ending at a small plateau that overlooked the valley. That's where I saw it. The boulder was massive, at least twice my height, and covered in moss and lichen. It stood alone, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately. What caught my attention was how it seemed slightly tilted to one side, like it was caught in a slow motion of falling, but never actually did. I approached it with curiosity, running my hand along its rough surface. To my surprise, it was warm, almost like it had been basking in the sun for hours. But there was no direct sunlight hitting it, not with the thick canopy above. I shrugged it off as some kind of geological anomaly. Maybe it absorbed heat differently or something. I didn't think much of it and continued my hike, but the image of that boulder lingered in my mind. The next day, I decided to check it out again. To my shock, the boulder seemed even more tilted than before, like it had shifted overnight. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my imagination, or perhaps it was just the angle from which I was looking at it. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I placed my hand on it again. It was still warm, almost comforting in a strange way. That's when I decided to try and climb it. After all, I was a climber, and that's what I did. I climbed things. I chalked up my hands and gripped the rock. But the moment I pulled myself up, a shiver ran down my spine. The warmth wasn't just from the surface. It was emanating from within the rock itself, like it was alive. I hesitated for a second, but shook it off. I mean, it was just a rock, right? As I ascended, the air around me grew hotter. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my palms felt clammy despite the chalk. Halfway up, I felt the boulder shudder, just a slight tremor, but enough to make me lose my footing. I scrambled to hold on, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd never felt anything like that before. I quickly made my way back down, my legs shaking. I told myself it was just an earthquake, a minor tremor, nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I visited the boulder every morning, watching it, waiting for something to happen. Each day, it seemed to tilt a little more. I took photos, made sketches, even measured the angle of its tilt. But what unnerved me the most was that warmth. No matter the time of day, no matter how cold the air was, the boulder remained warm. One evening, I decided to stay late, just to see if anything changed after dark. I sat a few meters away, watching as the shadows grew long and the forest grew silent. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver glow over everything. As I sat there, I heard a low hum, barely audible, like a distant whisper. It seemed to be coming from the boulder. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked over to it. The hum grew louder, more distinct, like a chant in a language I couldn't understand. I reached out and touched the rock, and it was burning hot. I yanked my hand back, staring at the boulder in disbelief. Then I saw it. Small cracks appeared along its surface, glowing faintly with an orange light, like veins of molten lava. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This was impossible. Rocks don't hum, they don't crack open and glow like that. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the boulder. The hum grew louder, resonating in my chest, making my teeth ache. I watched in horror as the cracks widened, the light spilling out like liquid fire. And then it stopped. The hum ceased, the light faded, and the boulder was just a rock again, tilted slightly to the side, the cracks barely visible in the moonlight. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. Eventually, I forced myself to turn around and walk away. I didn't look back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cracks, that light. I decided I wouldn't go back. I'd had enough of that damned boulder and whatever weirdness surrounded it. But when I woke up the next morning, there was this pull, this irresistible urge to go back, to see if anything had changed. I grabbed my gear and headed out, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to stay away. But my feet carried me forward, almost as if I was being drawn to it. When I reached the clearing, I froze. The boulder was gone. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was really gone. All that was left was a large, circular patch of scorched earth. I walked over to it, my heart hammering in my chest. I knelt down, running my fingers over the blackened ground. It was still warm, and the smell of burnt earth filled the air. I stood up looking around. Where could it have gone? It was a massive rock, and there were no signs of it being moved. No drag marks, no debris, nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I was about to turn back when I felt a vibration under my feet, faint but unmistakable. I froze, my blood ran cold. The ground beneath me began to crack, glowing with that same orange light. I stumbled back, watching in horror as the cracks spread, forming a pattern around the scorched circle. The hum returned, louder and more insistent, vibrating through my bones. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted down the trail, my lungs burning, my mind screaming at me to get away. When I finally reached my car, I threw myself inside and sped off, not caring about the narrow, winding road. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment. I locked the door and collapsed on the couch, my whole body trembling. I knew I couldn't stay there. Whatever that boulder was, whatever it was doing, it wasn't over. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and headed out. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get as far away as possible. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt my stomach drop. The hum was back, faint but there, like a distant echo. And then I saw it, a faint, glowing light on the horizon, pulsing in time with the hum. I floored the gas pedal, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back again, but I knew it was following me. I could feel it, that heat, that presence, growing stronger with every passing second. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually I couldn't go any further. My car sputtered to a stop, the engine dead. I was in the middle of nowhere, the road stretching out in both directions, empty and silent. I sat there, the hum now deafening, vibrating through the car. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a glowing light, getting closer. I jumped out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. The ground beneath me began to crack, the light spilling out, forming a circle around me. I was trapped. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar that drowned out my thoughts. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the noise. The cracks spread, the ground shaking beneath me. And then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back at the clearing. The boulder was there, towering over me, tilted slightly to the side, the cracks glowing faintly. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I was bound to the ground, the warmth of the earth seeping into my skin. The boulder hummed softly, almost soothingly, as the cracks widened. I could feel the heat rising, the light growing brighter. I knew what was coming, but there was nothing I could do. The ground beneath me gave way, and I was swallowed up, the light and heat enveloping me as the hum drowned out my screams. And then there was nothing, just darkness and the faint, distant echo of a hum. I never thought much about the old tales that floated around the village like autumn leaves. Stories of cursed objects, haunted woods, or spirits that roamed the night seemed like nonsense, just something the elders used to keep the kids from wandering too far. As a blacksmith, my world was solid and tangible: iron, fire, and sweat. So when I stumbled upon that peculiar piece of iron, I wasn't prepared for what followed. It was a damp, grey afternoon when I found it. I was collecting scraps near the edge of the forest, a place I rarely visited. Something glinted between the roots of a large oak tree, half buried in the muddy soil. I knelt down and dug it out, expecting a rusty old tool or perhaps a discarded horseshoe. Instead, I found a lump of iron, dark as night and unusually heavy for its size. I tried to brush off the mud, but the surface was strange, smooth and cold, like the iron itself was rejecting the touch of dirt. There was something odd about its weight too. It felt dense, as if it contained more than just metal within. I shrugged off the unease that crept up my spine and decided to take it back to the forge. After all, metal was metal, and there was no reason to waste good iron. Back in my workshop, I set the lump on my workbench. It seemed to absorb the light around it, casting an almost imperceptible shadow like a void in the middle of the room. I tried not to think too much about it as I stoked the fire in the forge. The familiar warmth and crackle of flames put my mind at ease. I placed the iron in the heart of the fire, expecting it to glow a bright red, as all iron does when heated. But this was different. The piece of iron began to glow, yes, but not in the usual way. It pulsed with a faint, reddish light, almost like it was alive. It was a subtle glow, more like the ember of a dying fire, but it felt wrong. The light wasn't just from the heat. It seemed to come from within the iron itself. As I hammered away, I noticed that the metal resisted my blows. Every strike felt as though the hammer was rebounding slightly, as if the iron didn't want to be shaped. I hit it harder, frustrated, and that's when I heard it, a low, almost inaudible hum, like the sound of distant chanting. I stopped, heart racing, and looked around, but there was no one there. Just me, the forge, and the stubborn piece of metal. The sound faded, and I tried to shake off the chill that had settled over me. I was imagining things, surely. I decided to try again the next day and put the iron aside, dousing the fire for the night. But sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the events of the day. I couldn't stop thinking about that hum and the way the iron glowed, like it was holding a secret it didn't want to share. The next morning, I returned to the forge with renewed determination. I was going to shake that iron, no matter what. I heated it again, and once more it glowed with that eerie reddish light. I swung the hammer, and this time the chanting was clearer, like a chorus of voices whispering just beyond the edge of my hearing. I tried to focus on the work, but the noise grew louder, filling my head with words I couldn't understand, yet felt unsettlingly familiar. I was sweating now, not just from the heat of the forge, but from fear. The iron was changing, warping under my hammer into something I didn't recognize, a twisted, jagged shape that looked more like a relic than a tool. And then, as I struck it one last time, the glow flared bright, almost blinding, and the voices screamed. I stumbled back, dropping the hammer. The piece of iron sat on the anvil, vibrating slightly. The glow had faded, but I could still hear the echo of those screams in my mind. I wanted to get rid of it, throw it into the deepest part of the river, but something held me back. It was as if the iron was compelling me, urging me to finish what I had started. Over the next few days, the compulsion grew stronger. I couldn't stay away from the forge. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the urge to hammer the iron, to complete whatever cursed thing it was meant to be. My hands ached, my eyes burned, but I couldn't stop. The whispers filled my mind day and night, a constant, maddening murmur that kept me awake and on edge. I knew I was losing myself, but I didn't care. I had to finish it. And then, one night, as the moon hung full and red in the sky, I did. The final blow echoed through the empty workshop, and the iron split open like a cracked egg. Inside, there was something alive. It looked like molten metal, shifting and writhing, but it had eyes. Dark, bottomless eyes that stared into mine with a hunger I can't describe. I was paralyzed, unable to look away as it rose from the anvil, stretching and twisting into a shape that defied comprehension. It spoke, not with words, but with thoughts that pierced my mind like needles. It thanked me for releasing it, for forging the vessel it needed to cross into this world. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen, trapped by those eyes and the unbearable weight of what I had done. The thing slithered forward, its form shifting and breaking apart, then reassembling as something more grotesque and nightmarish with each step. It wrapped around me, and I felt my skin burn where it touched. The pain was excruciating, but I welcomed it, anything to escape the horror of those eyes. It whispered in my mind, showing me visions of places that shouldn't exist, realms of darkness and despair beyond human understanding. And then it showed me my future. My body, lifeless on the ground, twisted and charred. My soul, bound to that cursed iron, trapped forever in its depths, screaming silently as it did when I hammered it. I realized then that the iron had been a prison, a seal that kept this thing contained. And I had broken it. The creature's laughter filled my mind as it tightened its grip. My vision blurred, and the world went dark. When I woke, I was lying on the cold floor of my workshop. The forge was out, and the piece of iron was gone. The pain was still there, a dull throb all over my body, but I was alive. Or at least I thought I was. I tried to stand but stumbled. My reflection in the mirror by the door caught my eye, and my heart froze. I wasn't me. My skin was grey and cracked, my eyes dark and hollow. I was a shell, a twisted echo of who I had been. And inside, I felt it, the thing, lurking, watching, using me. I am no longer the master of this body, merely a puppet, a vessel for something far older and darker than I can comprehend. I can feel it feeding on me, slowly erasing what little is left of who I once was. I know I won't last much longer. So if you find a piece of iron, strange and heavy, with a faint reddish glow, leave it where it lies. Don't touch it, don't try to shape it. For if you do, you might end up like me, a prisoner in your own flesh, a blacksmith who forged his own doom. And there is no escape from the darkness within. I've always been fascinated by the ocean. There's something about the vastness, the mystery hidden beneath the waves that has drawn me to it since I was a child. Shell collecting became my passion early on, a way to keep a piece of the sea with me wherever I went. I'd spend hours scouring the shoreline, looking for the most unique shells. It was peaceful, almost therapeutic, until I found that shell. I remember the day vividly. The sky was overcast, a grey blanket that hung low over the water, and the waves were restless, crashing against the shore with a force that seemed almost angry. I was walking along my usual route, eyes scanning the sand, when something caught my eye, a glimmer, a subtle gleam that stood out against the dull, wet sand. It was a conch shell, larger than any I had ever seen. Its surface was smooth, almost too smooth, and it seemed to shimmer slightly, even though the sun was hidden behind thick clouds. But what struck me the most was how wet it was, as if it had just been plucked from the ocean, despite lying there on the sand. Intrigued, I picked it up. The shell was cold to the touch, and my fingers were instantly soaked. I turned it over, inspecting its intricate walls and ridges. It was beautiful, in a way that felt almost unnatural. Without thinking, I lifted it to my ear, expecting to hear the familiar echo of the sea. Instead, I heard something else. A faint, muffled scream. I pulled the shell away from my ear immediately, my heart racing. It couldn't have been a scream, I must have imagined it. I took a deep breath and brought the shell back to my ear. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was like someone was trapped inside, crying out for help. For a moment, I considered throwing the shell back into the ocean, but curiosity, or maybe something else, held me back. I told myself I was just being silly. It was probably just the wind or a strange echo. I decided to take it home, telling myself that it was just another shell. But deep down, I knew this one was different. Back at my small seaside cottage, I placed the shell on the mantel above the fireplace among my other treasures. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that it was aware of being here. I tried to ignore it, but every time I glanced in its direction, I felt uneasy, like I was being observed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the ocean outside mingling with the uneasy silence of the house. I kept thinking about the shell, about the sound I had heard. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but it didn't work. Eventually, I got up and went into the living room. The The shell was still there, glistening in the dim light. It seemed almost alive, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of it, reaching out. My hand trembled as I picked it up. It was still wet, droplets of water sliding down my arm. I raised it to my ear again, slowly, hesitantly. The scream was louder now, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, I realized, filled with despair and something else, fear. I dropped the shell, stumbling back, my heart pounding in my chest. The shell hit the floor, but instead of breaking, it just rolled to a stop, glistening wetly. The sound echoed in my ears, lingering long after the shell had fallen silent. I didn't sleep at all that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. Who was she? How could she be trapped in there? My logical mind told me it was impossible, but the sound, the emotion in that scream, it felt too real. I had to know more. The next day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I took the shell to an old woman who lived on the outskirts of town. She was known for her knowledge of the sea, for the strange stories she told about the things that washed up on the shore. I had always thought she was just a crazy old lady, but now I wasn't so sure. When I showed her the shell, her eyes widened, and she stepped back as if it was something dangerous. She refused to touch it, her hands trembling as she made the sign of the cross. "You shouldn't have brought this here," she whispered. "This shell is cursed. It's a prison." "A prison?" I repeated, confused and a little scared. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the shell. "There are old legends, stories of the sea. They say that some spirits, when they die in great torment, become trapped, bound to the place of their death. Sometimes they get caught in things, objects that remain in the water. This shell, it holds one such spirit." I felt a chill run through me. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The old woman shook her head. "You must take it back. Return it to the ocean. It does not belong here, and the longer it stays, the stronger it will become." I didn't need to be told twice. I left her house, the shell wrapped tightly in a cloth. The sky had darkened, and the wind had picked up, a storm brewing on the horizon. I drove to the beach, the shell feeling heavier in my hand with each step. The waves were wild, crashing against the shore with a force that made me hesitate. But I had to do this. I waded into the water, up to my knees, the shell clutched tightly in my hand. I took a deep breath and hurled it as far as I could into the sea. For a moment, everything was still. Then the water erupted, a huge wave rising up, towering over me. I turned and ran, stumbling back to the shore, the wind howling around me. As I reached the sand, I glanced back. The wave had crashed down, but something was moving in the water, a dark shape rising from the depths. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I ran back to my car, the wind tearing at my clothes, the rain starting to fall in heavy drops. I drove home in a daze, the image of that dark shape burned into my mind. Back at the cottage, I collapsed onto the couch, my whole body trembling. I told myself it was over, that I had done what the old woman said, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I dreamed of the ocean, of the shell, of that voice screaming for help. I woke up to the sound of water dripping. Confused, I sat up and looked around. My heart stopped when I saw it. The shell was back, lying on the mantel, glistening wetly. But it was different now. Cracks had appeared along its surface, and from within, a dark liquid seeped out, pooling on the wood. I wanted to scream to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the shell as the cracks spread, as the liquid dripped onto the floor. And then I heard it, the scream, loud and clear, filling the room, echoing in my ears. The shell shattered, and from the pieces, something crawled out. A figure, twisted and broken, its eyes empty, its mouth open in a silent scream. It reached out to me, its fingers wet and cold, and I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. The last thing I remember is the cold, the feeling of water filling my lungs as the figure wrapped around me, dragging me down into darkness. The shell had been a prison, but now it was empty, and I was trapped inside. I've always loved kayaking. The sense of freedom that comes with gliding through water, surrounded by the tranquility of nature, is something I can't describe. It's my escape from the chaos of life. So, when I heard about this hidden spot in the forest, where the river was supposedly crystal clear, I had to see it for myself. It was an area not marked on any map, and only a few locals knew about it. They called it the Glass Veil. It took me an hour of paddling upstream to find it. The river twisted and turned through thick woods, the current sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce. The first thing I noticed was how abruptly the water changed. One moment, I was paddling through the usual murky brown. The next, it was like I'd crossed an invisible line. The water turned impossibly clear, like liquid glass. I could see the pebbles and small fish swimming lazily beneath me, even the occasional flash of a trout darting away. It was mesmerizing. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, fresh air fill my lungs. I dipped my paddle in and felt a strange resistance, like something was pulling against it. I brushed it off as the current played tricks on me and kept going. But the deeper I ventured into this clear patch, the more it felt like something was watching me. I can't explain it, but the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill ran down my spine. That's when it happened for the first time. My kayak, without warning, dipped slightly, as if something was tugging at the bottom. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my heart race. I looked around, half expecting to see a log or some submerged debris, but there was nothing. The water was as smooth as a mirror, reflecting the blue sky above. I shook off the unease and paddled on, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was in uncharted waters, and it was natural to feel a bit on edge. But the further I went, the stronger the pull became. It was as if invisible hands were reaching up, trying to drag me down. I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood for myself, but there was no shaking the feeling. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow from a passing cloud. But there was something off about it. It moved beneath me, dark and slow, like a massive fish or an eel. I leaned over the edge, peering into the water, but whatever it was had disappeared. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know why, but I felt a sudden urge to get out of there. I turned the kayak around, but the moment I tried to paddle back, the pull grew stronger. My kayak dipped again, this time more forcefully. Panic set in as I struggled to move forward, but it was like the water itself had turned against me. Every stroke of the paddle seemed to be in vain, the clear water rippling unnaturally around me. I forced myself to stay calm, taking deep breaths, and paddled harder. It felt like an eternity before I finally broke free from the clear patch. The moment I crossed that invisible line back into the murky water, the pull stopped. I looked back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The water behind me was calm and pristine, as if nothing had happened. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe there were strange currents I didn't know about. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but curiosity is a powerful thing. I found myself returning to the Glass Veil the very next day. I thought if I could just figure out what was causing the pull, I could put my mind at ease. This time, I was more cautious, staying at the edge of the clear water. I let my kayak drift, watching closely for any signs of movement below. That's when I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, distorted and ghostly, staring up at me from the depths. My heart stopped. They were pale, almost translucent, their eyes wide and empty. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light or the water playing with my eyes. But deep down, I knew it was real. I tried to back away, but my kayak wouldn't move. The water was still, yet I felt like I was being pulled down again, the invisible hands grabbing at the hull of my kayak. I screamed, panic taking over, and began paddling frantically. The faces below twisted and turned, mouths opening as if screaming silently. In my panic, I lost my balance and tipped over. The water was freezing, a shock to my system. I tried to swim up, but it felt like something was dragging me down. I kicked and thrashed, breaking the surface for a moment, gasping for air. The sky above seemed so far away. I looked down, and that's when I saw them clearly. The faces weren't just faces. They were bodies, hundreds of them, reaching up with skeletal hands. Their eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of despair. They weren't just trapped in the water. They were the water. The clear, pristine water I'd been so mesmerized by was made up of them, their souls bound to this cursed spot. I fought with everything I had, but I could feel them pulling me down, trekking me into their world. I tried to scream, but the water filled my mouth, choking me. I thought of my family, my friends, and the life I was about to lose. Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, I was lying on a riverbank, soaked and shivering. My kayak was overturned beside me, half submerged in the water. I scrambled away from the river, my body trembling with fear and cold. I looked back at the water, half expecting to see those faces staring back at me, but it was calm and clear, reflecting the sky as if nothing had happened. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my gear in the back and sped away, not daring to look back. I've never gone back to that spot. I've never even told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? It sounds like the ravings of a madman. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see them. The faces, the hands reaching up, and I wonder how many people they've claimed over the years. I think about how close I came to becoming one of them, just another lost soul trapped in the clear water of the glass veil. And I know, deep down, that it's still there waiting for the next curious kayaker to stumble upon it, to feel that slight pull and wonder what lies beneath the surface. I just hope they have the sense to paddle away before it's too late. But something tells me they won't. I'm a tax preparer, which means I spend most of my days surrounded by forms, spreadsheets, and endless numbers. It's usually a pretty straightforward job, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've felt spooked by anything. But there's one case that still haunts me, a case that made me question everything I knew about reality. It started on a Wednesday afternoon. I remember it clearly because I had just finished my third cup of coffee, and I was feeling pretty good about the stack of completed forms on my desk. That's when Mr. Carter walked in. Mr. Carter was a regular client, a quiet man in his 50s who always brought his paperwork in early. This time, though, he seemed agitated. His normally calm demeanor was replaced by nervous fidgeting. He handed me a manila folder and said, "Something's not right with this form. It keeps changing." I raised an eyebrow, thinking he must have been mistaken. Forms don't just change on their own. I opened the folder and pulled out the tax form. It looked normal at first glance. Name, address, social security number, all the usual stuff. But then I noticed something odd. There was a section I didn't recognize, a series of numbers and codes that made no sense. I flipped through the pages, but everything else seemed fine. I figured it must be a simple error. "Don't worry, Mr. Carter," I said, trying to reassure him. "I'll take a closer look and get this sorted out." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a look of genuine fear that made me uneasy. As he left, I felt a chill run down my spine. I shook it off and got back to work. Later that night, I took a closer look at the form. The strange section was still there, filled with numbers and symbols that I couldn't decipher. I decided to file it away and come back to it in the morning. The next day, I pulled out the form again. My heart skipped a beat. The numbers had changed. What was once a string of seemingly random figures now resembled a series of transactions, deposits, withdrawals, payments to accounts I'd never heard of. I double-checked everything, but there was no record of these transactions in any of Mr. Carter's previous filings. I thought maybe I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I decided to file it electronically just to see if it would go through. But as I clicked submit, a new line appeared, describing a transaction for $10,000 to a foreign account. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry. This wasn't possible. I hadn't entered that information. I deleted the line and tried again, but the same thing happened. Each time I tried to file the form, a new transaction would appear, and each one was more bizarre than the last. Panicking, I called Mr. Carter. "Has anything strange happened with your accounts recently?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated before answering. "I don't know. I've been getting calls from my bank, asking about large transfers I never made. I thought it was just a mistake." My heart was pounding. "Mr. Carter, I think there's something seriously wrong with your tax form. It keeps adding these transactions that I've never seen before." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he whispered, "I've been seeing things too. I don't know how to explain it, but I swear the numbers on my bank statements change every time I look at them. And last night, I saw someone standing outside my window. A shiver ran down my spine. Did you call the police?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And tell them what?" "That my tax form is haunted." They'd think I was crazy. I didn't know what to say. I promised I'd look into it and hung up, feeling more unsettled than ever. I knew I needed to find a logical explanation for what was happening, so I decided to pull up Mr. Carter's file and cross-reference it with previous years. That's when I saw it. The form had changed again. Now, instead of just listing transactions, there were details about properties and assets that Mr. Carter didn't own. Offshore accounts in his name. Real estate in countries he'd never visited. It was as if the form was creating an alternate version of his life, one where he was involved in all kinds of shady business dealings. I tried to delete the information, but the form wouldn't let me. Every time I removed a line, another one would appear, more sinister than the last. I could feel my pulse racing, and the room seemed to close in around me. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave it like this. I needed to know what was happening. I decided to print the form and take it to a friend of mine, a tech expert who could maybe make sense of it. As I watched the printer spit out page after page, I felt a sudden wave of nausea. Each sheet was filled with more disturbing details, criminal activities, names of people I didn't recognize, dates and places that made no sense. And then I saw it, my name. It was right there, listed as a recipient of one of the mysterious transactions. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just about Mr. Carter anymore. Somehow, I was being dragged into this nightmare. I grabbed the pages and ran out of the office, my hands shaking. I needed to find my friend, to figure out how this was happening and what I could do to stop it. I arrived at his place, breathless and sweating. He took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I shoved the papers at him and told him everything, my words tumbling over each other in a rush of fear and confusion. He spent hours analyzing the form, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "It's like the document is evolving, changing its code every time we try to understand it." "Can you stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He looked at me, his face pale. "I don't know. This isn't just some glitch. It's almost like it's alive." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Alive? How could a form be alive? But deep down, I knew he was right. This was no ordinary document. It was something else, something malevolent. We spent the rest of the night trying to find a way to erase the form, to break whatever hold it had on Mr. Carter, and now on me. But every attempt failed. No matter what we did, the form persisted, adding new lines, new details, until it felt like it was unraveling my entire life. Exhausted and defeated, I left my friend's place just before dawn. As I walked to my car, I noticed something strange. My phone buzzed with a notification, an email from Mr. Carter. I hesitated, then opened it. The email was short, just a single sentence. "I can't take it anymore." I jumped into my car and sped to his house, my heart in my throat. When I arrived, I found the door unlocked. I called his name, but there was no answer. The house was eerily silent. I found him in his office, slumped over his desk. There was a printed copy of the form in front of him, covered in red ink. He had scribbled all over it, writing the same word over and over again, "Stop." But it hadn't stopped. The last line on the form, written in a shaky hand, read, "I'm sorry." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to do, who to call. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced at it with dread. Another email, but this time it was from my own account. It was the same form, the one with my name on it. I felt my legs give out, and I collapsed to the floor, the room spinning around me. I knew then that this wasn't over. Whatever had taken hold of Mr. Carter had now set its sights on me, and I had no idea how to escape it. The form would keep changing, evolving, until there was nothing left of me. And then it would move on to the next person, and the next, an endless cycle of fear and despair. I glanced at the form one last time, my vision blurring. A new line had appeared, describing a transaction that hadn't happened yet, but I knew it would, because I was the one who was going to make it happen. I first noticed the stone on a damp morning at the back of my workshop. It was just sitting there, as if someone had dropped it off overnight. It was a rough block, almost perfectly square, with a smooth surface that seemed out of place. At first, I thought it might be a gift from a fellow carver or a neighbor. It wasn't unusual for us to trade materials, especially if someone had no use for a particular piece. I approached it cautiously, my boots crunching on the gravel floor of the shed. The stone was about waist high, covered in a fine layer of dust. When I brushed it off, the surface beneath was almost pristine, save for a few natural veins running through the marble. It was the kind of stone that called out to be shaped, but there was something else. As I ran my hand over it, I felt warmth radiating from within. Not the warmth of a stone left in the sun, but something different. It was like the heat of a living being. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my imagination. After all, I'd been working late into the night on another project and probably wasn't thinking straight. Still, I couldn't shake off the strange feeling it gave me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to carve it. I had a commission for a garden statue, and this block seemed perfect for it. I set up my tools and secured the block onto the carving table. As the chisel struck the stone for the first time, a deep, hollow thump echoed through the workshop. I stopped, the sound vibrating through my bones. I paused, half expecting something to happen, but the room remained silent, the only noise the faint hum of the old ceiling fan above. I chiseled again, and there it was, thump. It was as if something was trapped inside the stone, knocking back in response to each hit. I'm not the superstitious type, but a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't a normal sound for marble. I tried tapping it with my knuckles, and instead of the solid, dense ripple I expected, the stone seemed to resonate, like a drum. I thought maybe there was a flaw inside, an air pocket or something similar. If that were the case, it could ruin the entire piece. I considered abandoning it right there, but something about the stone kept me going. I felt drawn to it, like it was calling out to me. Over the next few days, I worked on it tirelessly, chipping away slowly. Every thump seemed to grow softer, like whatever was inside was getting tired, or was somehow retreating deeper into the stone. I sculpted the rough shape of a woman draped in flowing robes. It was a design I'd used before, but this time it felt different, almost as if I wasn't the one deciding the form. People in the town started noticing the piece. Friends and neighbors who dropped by the workshop would comment on how lifelike it was, how it seemed to have a presence. I would just nod and smile, not really knowing how to explain the unease building inside me. As the days went on, I began to hear whispers in the workshop. Faint and unintelligible at first, they grew louder the more I chiseled. I started avoiding working on the piece at night. The shadows in the corners of the shed seemed to stretch towards it, and the whispers turned to low, mournful wails. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I resolved to break the stone apart and be done with it. Maybe it was a cowardly decision, but I was tired of feeling like a stranger in my own workshop. As I lifted the hammer, I hesitated, a strange compulsion stopping me from delivering the blow. I don't know what made me do it, but I pressed my ear to the stone. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly from deep within, I heard it, a heartbeat. My own heart raced in response, and I stumbled back, dropping the hammer. What was I dealing with here? I couldn't tell anyone. They'd think I'd gone mad. Hell, I was beginning to think I was losing my mind. The statue, though unfinished, seemed almost complete in a way I hadn't intended. The face, the hands, everything seemed so alive. I stopped carving. Days passed, then weeks. The stone sat there, an unfinished, unnerving presence in my workshop. I avoided it as best as I could, working on other projects, but it felt like the statue was watching me. I know how crazy that sounds, but it's the truth. One night, after a few too many drinks at the local bar, I stumbled back into the workshop, cursing myself for letting a piece of stone get the better of me. I picked up the chisel and hammer and, in a drunken rage, began to hack at the stone, determined to finish it, to silence whatever was inside once and for all. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was deafening now, like the heartbeat of a giant. I struck harder, the hollow echo reverberating in my chest. I felt the vibrations travel up my arm, through my bones, into my skull. The whispers were back, louder this time, surrounding me, filling my head. Then, without warning, the stone cracked. A thin, jagged line split down the center of the statue. From within the crack, something dark seeped out, like smoke, but thicker, almost liquid. I stumbled back, dropping the tools. The smoke coiled and writhed, spreading across the workshop floor, filling the air with a heavy, oppressive presence. The statue, now broken and disfigured, seemed to shift, its once serene face contorting into a grotesque snarl. The smoke began to take shape, forming the outline of a figure, indistinct but undeniably human. I watched, frozen in place, as the figure stepped out from the stone, dragging with it a sense of despair so deep it felt like drowning. It spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that echoed through the workshop. It spoke of pain, of being trapped, of centuries of darkness and rage. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only listen as it told me of its imprisonment, how it had been bound to the stone by some ancient curse, and how, through my carving, I had unwittingly set it free. I wanted to run to escape, but my legs felt like lead. The figure loomed over me, its eyes, if they were eyes, burning with a malevolent light. It reached out, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, like it was ripping something out of me. I blacked out then, the pain too much to bear. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of my workshop. The statue was gone, nothing left but a pile of rubble. The tools were scattered around me, and my chest ached like I'd been struck by lightning. I got up slowly, every bone in my body protesting. I don't know how I made it out of there. I don't know how I made it home. All I remember is the darkness, the cold, and the knowledge that I had unleashed something terrible into the world. It's been weeks since that night. I've locked up the workshop and haven't gone back since. I've tried to forget, to move on, but I can't escape the feeling that it's still out there, watching me waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the thump again, faint and distant, like the beating of a heart. And I know, deep down, that it's not over. I've tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, a drunken hallucination, but I can't shake the feeling of something missing. Like a part of me was left behind in that workshop, trapped in the stone. I can't go back. I won't. But I know one thing for certain, whatever was in that stone, it's out now. And I fear it won't rest until it's found whatever it's looking for. I've been cleaning jewelry for almost 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Sparkling diamonds, intricate gold chains, even the occasional antique heirloom. But nothing ever prepared me for that one ring. It was a slow Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Harris, one of my regular clients, brought it in. She's one of those old ladies who seem to know everyone and everything in the neighborhood, always carrying a smile and some juicy gossip. But that day she looked different, worried almost. "Tom, could you take a look at this for me?" she asked, sliding a small velvet box across the counter. I opened it carefully, half expecting some broken clasp or a tarnished piece of silver. But inside was a ring, plain, silver, with a single black stone in the center. It didn't look old or expensive, but it had this presence. "It's never lost its shine," Mrs. Harris murmured, almost to herself. "I've had it for years, and it's never dulled, never needed polishing. I thought it was just a good piece, you know. But lately, it's been strange." I glanced at her, waiting for her to continue. "It's been getting colder," she said finally. "Every time I touch it, it feels like it's been left in the freezer." Now, I've heard plenty of odd things in my time, but this was a new one. I shrugged it off, figuring she was just imagining things. "I'll give it a good clean and polish," I assured her. "It'll be good as new." I took the ring to the back, my little workshop filled with tools, magnifying glasses, and cleaning solutions. As I held it under the light, I noticed how perfect it was, no scratches, no signs of wear. I reached for my cleaning cloth and gave it a gentle rub. The moment the cloth touched the metal, I felt it, a slight chill creeping up my fingers. I shook it off, attributing it to my imagination, and continued polishing. But the more I worked on it, the colder it became. By the time I was done, my fingers felt numb, like I'd been handling ice. And the ring, well, it looked the same, perfect and untarnished, not a single smudge or scratch on it. I placed it back in the box and went to hand it over to Mrs. Harris, but as I did, I couldn't shake off this uneasy feeling, like the ring was watching me. Ridiculous, I know, but I swear it felt like it had eyes. "Did you feel it?" Mrs. Harris asked as I returned it to her. "Feel what?" "The cold." I hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, a bit, but I'm sure it's nothing. Maybe it's just the material." She didn't look convinced. "Keep it for a few days, would you? See if you can figure out what's wrong with it." I wanted to refuse, to tell her that I didn't have time for this, but something about the way she asked made me agree. I put the ring in my safe and tried to forget about it. That night, I locked up the shop and headed home, the thought of the ring lingering in the back of my mind. The next morning, I arrived at the shop, and the first thing I did was check on the ring. I'd opened the safe and there it was, still gleaming as if it had just been made. But when I picked it up, it was colder than before, much colder. I decided to run a few tests. I tried heating it up with a blow dryer, but it remained icy to the touch. I dipped it in hot water, nothing. It was like the ring was absorbing the heat and leaving nothing but cold in its wake. Curiosity getting the better of me, I decided to look into its history. Mrs. Harris said she'd had it for years, but never mentioned where she got it from. I called her, asking for more information. It was a gift from my husband, she explained. He found it at an old antique shop before we got married. I've always worn it, but after he passed away, I put it away. I just couldn't bear to look at it. And now, her voice trailed off. Something about the story didn't sit right with me, so I asked around, visited a few local shops, and even looked online, but there was no mention of a ring like it anywhere. It was like it didn't exist. The nights after I brought the ring home were the worst. I began having these vivid nightmares, cold, dark places, with shadows whispering things I couldn't understand. Every time I woke up, the room would be freezing, even though the heater was on full blast. One night, I awoke with a start, drenched in sweat despite the cold. I looked over at the drawer where I kept the ring, and I swear I saw it, a faint, icy mist seeping out. I thought I was going mad, but when I reached for the drawer, the mist vanished, and the ring was just sitting there, innocently gleaming back at me. I couldn't take it anymore. The ring was getting under my skin, its coldness spreading through me like a sickness. I decided to return it to Mrs. Harris and be done with it. But when I called her, there was no answer. I tried again and again, but nothing. Worried, I went to her house. The lights were off, and the place seemed deserted. I knocked, then pounded on the door, but there was no response. I called the cops, and when they arrived, they broke down the door. We found her in the living room, sitting in her favorite chair, the ring on her finger. Her skin was pale, almost blue, and when they touched her, she was ice cold. The paramedics said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. It was the ring. It had done something to her. I should have left it alone, but I couldn't. I took the ring from her cold, lifeless hand and went back to the shop. I had to get rid of it. I drove to the nearest river, intending to throw it in, but as I stood there, staring at the black water, I hesitated. What if it came back? What if it found its way to someone else, did the same thing? No, I couldn't risk it. I decided to lock it up, hide it where no one would find it. I put it in the safest place I could think of, a small reinforced box buried deep in the ground behind the shop. It felt like the cold was seeping through the earth, but I forced myself to leave it, to walk away. Weeks passed, and things returned to normal. The nightmares stopped, the shop went back to its usual routine. But sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up feeling that familiar chill creeping through the walls. And I'd know. The ring was still there waiting. Last night, I dreamt of Mrs. Harris. She was standing by the river, the ring back on her finger, and she was crying. She looked at me with those empty eyes and said, "It's never going to let you go." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I'm not sure how much longer I can take this. The cold is spreading, seeping into my bones. I'm losing sleep, my mind feels foggy, and every time I close my eyes, I see that ring gleaming in the dark. I don't know how this story ends, but I'm starting to think that Mrs. Harris was right. It's never going to let me go. I still remember the day I stumbled upon that cursed piece of wood. It was a chilly afternoon, and the old lumber mill on the outskirts of town was empty. The owner, Mr. Harris, let me rummage through the piles, knowing my penchant for finding the perfect material for my violins. I had made a name for myself in the small, close-knit community of luthiers. My violins were known for their rich, soulful tones. But I was always in search of something different, something unique. I found it buried under a pile of discarded planks, almost hidden from sight. It was a small, dark piece of wood, no larger than my forearm, and it seemed to hum when I touched it. I brushed it off as my imagination, the cold of the day making my senses more alert. But as I lifted it, I felt a faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat. It was eerie, yet captivating. "What are you doing with that old thing?" Mr. Harris had asked, eyeing the piece of wood skeptically. "Just something about it," I replied, not entirely sure myself why I was drawn to it. "It feels alive." He shook his head, muttering something about artists and their quirks, and let me take it home for a few bucks. I placed it in my workshop, intending to carve a small violin, maybe a viola, out of it. But every time I touched it, I felt that odd vibration, as if the wood was resonating with my own heartbeat. I decided to let it be for a few days, thinking it might be some strange effect of the humidity or the grain of the wood. But curiosity got the better of me. I began carving it, and the wood yielded easily to my tools, almost as if it wanted to be shaped, to be molded into something beautiful. As I carved, I noticed something strange. The more I worked on it, the more the vibrations grew. It wasn't just a sensation anymore. I could hear it. A faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to fill the room whenever I was near. I told myself it was just the sound of the tools, the pressure of the blade against the grain. But deep down, I knew it was something more. When I finally finished the violin, it was a thing of beauty. The wood had a deep, almost black sheen, and the body was smooth and flawless. It was perfect, but there was something unsettling about it. I strung it with the finest strings I had and placed it on the table, staring at it as if it were a wild animal that could leap at me any moment. The first time I played it, I knew I had made a mistake. The sound that emerged was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was haunting, a low, mournful tone that seemed to crawl under your skin and nestle there. It was as if the violin was speaking, telling stories of despair and sorrow in a language that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my hands shook as I played. The vibrations were stronger now, almost like the violin was alive, pulsing with some dark energy. I put it down, my heart racing, my mind filled with a dread I couldn't explain. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the violin haunted me, echoing in my head even though the instrument lay silent in my workshop. I tried to brush it off, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, lying there waiting. I thought I was losing my mind. Days passed, and I didn't dare touch it again. But then, I received a call from a client. He was a renowned violinist, known for his emotional performances. He had heard about my new creation through some mutual contacts and wanted to try it. I hesitated, but then agreed. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a violin, and I was letting my imagination run wild. He came over the next day, a tall, thin man with an intense gaze. I handed him the violin, and as soon as his fingers brushed the strings, he flinched. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice tight. "Nothing," he said, though his eyes told a different story. "It's just strange." He began to play, and the sound filled the room. It was the same haunting tone, the same mournful wail that had disturbed me so deeply. But it was more powerful now, amplified by his skill and emotion. As he played, I saw his expression change. It went from curiosity to confusion, then to something like fear. He stopped abruptly, his face pale, his hands trembling. What is this?" he whispered, looking at the violin as if it had grown fangs. "I don't know," I admitted, the fear I had been suppressing rising to the surface. "It's the wood. There's something wrong with it." He placed the violin on the table and backed away, his eyes never leaving it. "It's cursed," he said, his voice shaking. "I've never felt anything like this. It's like it's feeding off me." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, my mouth dry, my heart pounding. He left in a hurry, refusing to take the violin with him. I was alone again, with that cursed instrument lying there, mocking me with its silence. I tried to destroy it. I tried breaking it, burning it, but nothing worked. It was as if the wood was indestructible, immune to any harm I tried to inflict. And the hum, that dreadful hum, was growing louder, more insistent. I stopped working. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep. I could feel the violin's presence, even when I was in another room. It was like it was calling to me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. I had to get rid of it. I took it to the river one night, intending to throw it in and be done with it. But as I stood there, holding it over the water, I felt something strange. A coldness, a sense of despair so profound it almost made me weep. I dropped the violin in the river and watched as it floated away, the dark water swallowing it up. I thought it was over. I thought I was free, but the next morning it was back, lying on my workbench, wet and gleaming, as if it had never left. The hum was deafening now, a constant drone that filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and left, abandoning my workshop, my home, everything. I moved to a new town, took up a new job, but it didn't help. The hum followed me, echoing in my dreams, in the silence of the night. And then, one day, I found it, lying on my bed, waiting for me. The violin, perfect and pristine, its strings glistening in the dim light. I don't know how it found me. I don't know what it wants, but I can feel it. It's growing stronger, feeding off my fear, my despair. I can't escape it. I can't destroy it. It's a part of me now, a dark, twisted part that will never let me go. I can hear it even now, as I write this, its mournful wail filling the room, a reminder of my mistake, my curse. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The hum is driving me mad, the vibrations shaking me to my core. I feel what will happen when I can't resist its call anymore, when I pick it up and play that final terrible note. Maybe then I'll understand. Maybe then I'll know what it wants. But until then, I'm trapped, haunted by a piece of wood and the music of despair it sings. God help me. I've been snowboarding for years, chasing the thrill down the steepest and most dangerous slopes I could find. So when I heard about the icy slope from some locals in the small town of Frost Creek, I was more than intrigued. They warned me about it, of course. They said it was a place where the snow never melted, even in the warmest of summers. But that didn't scare me off, it just made me more curious. I'd come to Frost Creek looking for a challenge, something that would give me the adrenaline rush I craved. After days of boring, standard runs down the slopes around the town, the icy slope seemed like exactly what I needed. One afternoon, I asked around about how to get there. People gave me wary looks, told me it wasn't a good idea. They said strange things happened on that slope, that it wasn't worth the risk. But they didn't know me. I thrived on the kind of fear that made other people turn away. Finally, an old guy in the bar decided to give me directions. "You really want to go there?" he asked, eyes narrowed. "Don't say I didn't warn ya. It's up past the tree line, off the main paths. You'll know it when you see it. It's different." I nodded and left early the next morning, strapping my board to my back and heading out before the sun even peeked over the horizon. The air was cold, but not unbearable, and I was sweating by the time I reached the tree line. It wasn't hard to find the path the old man had described, and soon enough I was there. He was right. It was different. The slope stretched out before me, a sharp, glittering sheet of ice cutting through the snow-covered landscape. It was uncanny, the way the rest of the mountain was blanketed in soft, powdery snow, while this path was slick, icy, almost unnatural. I strapped on my board, feeling a rush of excitement mixed with just a hint of unease. The surface was smooth and perfect for speed. I took a deep breath and pushed off, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline as I picked up speed. But something was off, the sound. It started low at first, almost like the faint hum of a tuning fork, vibrating through my board and into my bones. Then it grew louder, a high-pitched screeching that cut through the air like a banshee's wail. It echoed off the trees and the rocks around me, growing louder with every passing second. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my ride, but it was impossible. The noise seemed to follow me, chasing me down the slope, wrapping around me like a living thing. The screeching grew so intense that I felt it in my teeth, vibrating in my skull, making my vision blur. It was as if the ice itself was screaming, protesting against my presence. I dug my heels in, trying to slow down, but my board kept sliding. I wasn't in control anymore. The slope seemed to take over, guiding me down faster and faster. And then I saw them. Figures barely visible, shimmering in the ice beneath me. Faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but they were still there, shifting and writhing just beneath the surface. Panic set in, my breath coming in short gasps as I struggled to keep my balance. The screeching reached a fever pitch as the faces moved with me, their hollow eyes following my every move. I couldn't take it anymore. I veered off to the side, desperate to stop, and crashed hard into a snowbank. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment, Everything went black. When I came to, the slope was silent. I lay there for a while, catching my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The faces were gone, and the ice looked smooth and innocent again. I told myself it was just the speed, the adrenaline playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I should have left then. I should have packed up and gone back to town, but I couldn't. I had to conquer it, had to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. So I went back. Day after day, I returned to that slope, and every time the screeching would start again. Every time the faces would appear, clearer and more desperate than before. I tried to drown out the sound, bringing headphones, blasting music, but it never worked. The screeching would cut through the noise, filling my head with its unrelenting wail. The faces seemed closer each time, their features becoming more defined, more human. They weren't just faces anymore. They were people. Trapped. I became obsessed, trying to figure out what was happening. I scoured old records in the town's library, asking questions, digging through newspaper clippings and local legends. There were stories, of course. Stories about missing people, hikers and snowboarders who had vanished on that slope over the years. They were all written off as accidents, but I knew better. The last time I went up there, I was determined to get to the bottom of it, to find some proof of what I was seeing. I brought a camera, strapped it to my helmet, and set off down the slope. The screeching started almost immediately, louder and more intense than ever. The faces were there too, so close I could almost touch them. I pushed on, fighting the urge to stop, to turn back. I had to know. I had to see it through. And then the ice cracked. It started as a small fissure beneath my board, but it spread rapidly, zigzagging across the slope like a living thing. I tried to steer away, but the crack followed me, widening as it went. The faces below looked up at me, their mouths moving soundlessly, pleading. I don't know why I didn't stop. Maybe I couldn't. Maybe the slope wouldn't let me. I rode on, the crack spreading wider and wider until, with a deafening roar, the ice gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness, the screeching all around me, the faces closing in. I hit something hard, knocking the air out of my lungs. I was in a cavern, the walls made of ice, shimmering with a cold, unnatural light. They were all around me, the lost ones, their bodies encased in the ice, eyes wide and unseeing. I could hear them now, whispers in the back of my mind, a cacophony of voices begging for release, for help. I tried to move, but I was stuck, my board wedged in the ice. I could feel the cold creeping up my legs, numbing my skin, seeping into my bones. I struggled, pulling and clawing, but it was no use. The ice was closing around me, trapping me, pulling me down. As the cold reached my chest, my vision blurred, my thoughts slowing. I could still hear the voices, still see the faces staring out at me, but they were fading, growing distant. I knew then that I wasn't getting out. I was going to be one of them, another face in the ice, another voice in the chorus of the lost. The screeching was the last thing I heard, echoing through the cavern as the ice swallowed me whole. And now I'm here, trapped in the cold, my face just another among the countless others. We're all here, waiting for the next one to come, to ride the slope and hear the screeching, to join us in the darkness. So if you ever find yourself in Frost Creek and someone tells you about the icy slope, take my advice. Don't go there. Don't listen to the call of the ice, the lure of the challenge. Because once you hear the screeching, it's already too late. You'll be one of us, forever. I've been a caving guide for about 7 years now, leading groups through some of the most breathtaking and treacherous underground systems in the country. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the events that unfolded during my last expedition. It started with a new cave, uncharted and untouched, at least according to the maps. I first heard about it from an old-timer at a local caving bar. He mentioned a cave entrance hidden deep within the forest, one that supposedly didn't stay the same. Of course, I shrugged it off as just another drunken tale. Cavers love to embellish their stories, myself included, but curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to check it out. Finding the entrance was a challenge in itself. It was tucked away behind a dense thicket, the kind of place you'd miss unless you were looking for it. The mouth of the cave was narrow and almost seemed to breathe, as if the earth itself was exhaling through the gap. I squeezed through, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Inside, the air was cool and damp, with the familiar scent of wet stone and moss. I switched on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The walls were smooth, unnaturally so, and the ground was littered with peculiar stalagmites. They weren't like any I'd seen before. They were thin and pointed, almost too perfect, as if someone had taken the time to carve them by hand. I ventured deeper, marking my path with chalk as I went. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. The passages twisted and turned in odd ways, as if they were deliberately trying to confuse me. But that wasn't the worst of it. Every time I glanced back, the stalagmites seemed different. Their shapes had shifted ever so slightly, and I could have sworn some had moved closer to the path I'd just taken. Brushing it off as a trick of the light, I pressed on, but the unsettling feeling in my gut grew stronger. The cave seemed to pulse around me, the walls almost vibrating with a low hum that resonated deep in my bones. I told myself it was just my imagination, but part of me knew something wasn't right. I finally reached a wide chamber, the ceiling towering high above me. In the center stood a massive stalagmite, its surface smooth and polished like marble. It was easily twice my height, and at its base, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were carvings, primitive, almost childlike figures etched into the stone. They depicted people, or at least what looked like people, kneeling before a larger shadowy figure. A sudden breeze swept through the chamber, extinguishing my headlamp for a split second. I fumbled with it, my heart racing, and when the light flickered back on, I saw it. A shadow darted across the far wall, disappearing into one of the side tunnels. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming for me to turn back, but my legs moved on their own, following the shadow deeper into the cave. The tunnel narrowed, forcing me to crouch as I made my way through. The air grew colder, the walls pressing in on me from all sides. My breaths came in short gasps, and my skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. I reached another chamber, smaller than the last, and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the center of the room, was a figure. At first, I thought it was another stalagmite, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a statue. It was carved from the same stone as the keg itself, a perfect likeness of a man. No, not a man. Something else. Its features were distorted, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to stare right through me. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The statue was new. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I turned to leave, but the tunnel behind me had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of rock. Panic surged through me, and I frantically searched for another way out. That's when I noticed them, more carvings on the walls. They were like the ones I'd seen before, but these were different. They showed people wandering aimlessly through the cave, their bodies contorted in agony, their eyes gouged out. A scream echoed through the chamber, and I spun around, my headlamp casting wild shadows across the walls. The statue had moved. Its arm was outstretched, pointing directly at me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Statues didn't move. Caves didn't shift. But the evidence was right in front of me. I backed away, and as I did, I felt the ground give way beneath me. I tumbled into darkness, my body slamming against the rough stone as I fell. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I came to, I was in a different part of the cave. My headlamp was gone, shattered in the fall, and I was left with only the faint glow of my phone's flashlight. I was alone, completely and utterly alone. The silence was deafening, the darkness absolute. I tried to get my bearings, but the cave seemed to stretch on forever in all directions. I stumbled forward, my hands trailing along the walls, desperately searching for an exit, but the cave wouldn't let me go. Every path I took looped back on itself, the passages twisting and turning in impossible ways. Time lost all meaning. Hours, days, weeks, I couldn't tell. My phone died, and I was left in total darkness. My only company was the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I saw things in the dark, shadows that flitted just out of reach, figures that melted into the stone whenever I tried to approach. I don't know how long I wandered, my mind slowly unraveling with each step. I was starving, dehydrated, my body weak and trembling. But the cave wouldn't let me die. It kept me on the brink, just enough to keep moving, to keep searching for a way out that didn't exist. And then, one day or night, I couldn't tell, I found it. A crack in the wall, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. I forced myself into it, clawing at the stone, my fingers bleeding as I dragged myself through. On the other side was a small chamber, empty except for a single figure huddled in the corner. It was a man, or what was left of him. His clothes were tattered, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He looked up as I entered, his eyes wide and hollow. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a dry rust, his lips cracking as he mouthed a single word: "Help." I stumbled back, my heart lurching in my chest. This was impossible. I recognized him. He was the old-timer from the bar, the one who told me about the cave. He was supposed to be dead. I'd seen his obituary in the paper months ago. But here he was, alive, or something close to it. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The man, or the thing that had once been a man, reached out a bony hand, his fingers brushing against my arm. His touch was ice-cold, and I yanked away, my mind screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The chamber had no exit, no way out. And then I saw it. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of them, all depicting the same scene. Figures huddled in the dark, their faces twisted in terror, their hands clawing at the stone as the cave closed in around them. And in the center of each carving, the same shadowy figure loomed, its eyes empty voids that seemed to stare straight into my soul. I realized then what the cave wanted. It wasn't just a place. It was alive, a living, breathing thing that fed on the fear and despair of those who entered. And I was its latest victim, trapped in its endless maze, a prisoner in the dark. I'm still here, writing this on a scrap of paper I found in my pack. I don't know if anyone will ever find it, or if it will just become part of the cave like everything else. But if you're reading this, if you somehow find your way to this cursed place, turn back. Don't follow the shadows. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, don't look into its eyes. I never thought my job could turn into a nightmare. Cleaning water tanks isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills. I've been doing it for years, scrubbing away algae, draining stale water, and making sure people have clean water to drink. It's usually a pretty straightforward job. That was until I got a call from the old apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The place was a bit of a legend among my colleagues, and not for good reasons. It had this eerie, almost deserted vibe to it. You'd think it was abandoned if you saw it, with the chipped paint, broken windows, and weeds growing everywhere. But people lived there, mostly older folks and a few families who couldn't afford to live anywhere else. The manager, Mr. Patel, called me one evening. He sounded almost desperate. The main water tank needs a deep clean, he said. No one's touched it in years. I didn't ask why. Jobs like this don't come up often, and they pay well. So I grabbed my gear and headed over the next morning. The tank was massive, hidden away in a small shed behind the building. When I first opened the hatch and peered inside, it was full to the brim. The water looked clear enough, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. I shrugged it off, put on my gloves, and started draining the tank. It took hours for the water to drain completely, and that's when I saw it. Scratches, hundreds of them, all over the inner walls. They weren't random marks. They seemed to form a pattern, but one I couldn't make sense of. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough grooves etched into the concrete. I've seen tanks in all sorts of conditions, but I'd never seen anything like this. I finished up the job, scrubbing the tank and refilling it with fresh water. But the image of those scratches lingered in my mind long after I left. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those strange marks. A week later, Mr. Patel called again. "The tank's full, but we're having issues with the water pressure," he said. "Can you come back and take a look?" When I got there, I went straight to the tank. I drained it again, and there they were, new scratches more than before. The pattern was different, more complex, almost like it was trying to say something. My heart pounded as I traced the lines with my fingers. It was as if the tank itself was alive, communicating in a language I couldn't understand. I took some photos, thinking I could ask someone about it later. Maybe it was some kind of vandalism or a reaction in the concrete. But who would break into an old shed just to scratch up a water tank? I cleaned it again, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. When I refilled the tank, The water seemed to ripple unnaturally, like something was moving just beneath the surface. I told myself I was imagining things, packed up and left. But the scratches kept appearing. Every time I drained the tank, there was a new pattern, more intricate and unreadable than the last. I even tried scrubbing them away completely, but they always came back, each time more menacing. I started to get paranoid. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, convinced I heard the sound of scratching echoing in my head. It was driving me insane. My wife said I was overworked, but I knew something wasn't right. I decided to confront Mr. Patel about it. Maybe he knew something. When I asked him, his face went pale. He hesitated, then finally said, "There's something wrong with this place. People say it's cursed. That tank, no one knows who built it. It's been here longer than the building itself." I laughed it off at the time, but his words stuck with me. I started researching the place, digging through old records. The apartment complex was built in the 80s, but there were mentions of a well or a cistern on the property going back to the early 1900s. There were stories, disappearances, strange deaths, and people who went mad after drinking the water. I didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but there was definitely something wrong with that tank. I decided I'd do one last job, drain it completely, scrub every inch, and seal it off for good. I packed my tools and headed out just before dawn, determined to put an end to it. The sun was barely up when I got to the shed. I opened the hatch and started the pump. As the water drained away, I could see the scratches again, clearer than ever. They seemed to shimmer in the dim light, almost moving. I climbed inside, shining my flashlight around. The pattern was different this time, more structured, like a series of symbols or runes. I couldn't look away. My head started to spin, and I felt a strange pull, as if something was drawing me closer. Suddenly, the water level dropped sharply, revealing the bottom of the tank. My heart froze. There, etched into the concrete, was a giant, spiraled symbol, like a whirlpool made of countless lines. It was the source, the origin of all the scratches. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the surface, I felt a shock, like an electric jolt running up my arm. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The water around me started to ripple, and I heard a faint sound, like whispering, echoing from the walls. Panic set in, and I scrambled out of the tank. As I reached the top, I glanced back, and that's when I saw it. The water was rising, faster than it should have. It was almost as if it was being pushed up from below. And in the center, the spiraled symbol began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. I slammed the hatch shut and backed away, trembling. Finally, I finished. I stepped back, breathing heavily, and watched the seal dry. The tank was silent now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I left the complex and never looked back. I deleted the photos and burned my notes. I didn't want any reminders of what I'd seen, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, I dreamt of the tank, of the spiraled symbol, and the thing that lurked beneath the water. A few weeks later, I heard the news. The old apartment complex was condemned and slated for demolition. Part of me was relieved. I thought that maybe, finally, the nightmare was over. But then I got the call. It was Mr. Patel. His voice was shaky, almost hysterical. "The workers found something," he said, "under the tank. You need to see it." I didn't want to go, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, the building was gone, reduced to rubble. A group of workers stood around the exposed foundation, whispering among themselves. I pushed through the crowd and froze. There, under the tank, was a massive ancient well, lined with black stones. The spiraled symbol was carved into each one, glowing faintly. The well was filled to the brim with water, and in the center, something moved, something dark and twisted, slowly rising to the surface. I turned and ran, the whispers following me, growing louder, echoing in my head. I never looked back. I don't clean water tanks anymore. I've moved far away, changed my name, and tried to forget. But I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see the scratches, the symbol, and the thing that lurks beneath the water waiting. Because I know, deep down, it's not over. It's never over. I'd been performing aerial silks for almost 10 years, but I'd never experienced anything like this before. It all started when I found that set of silks at a flea market downtown. They were deep crimson, and even in the dim light, they seemed to shimmer slightly. Something about them called to me, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Maybe it was the way they seemed to almost breathe in the breeze, swaying ever so slightly as if they had a life of their own. The seller was an old woman, hunched and quiet. She barely spoke when I asked her about them. "Those silks, they belonged to a performer long ago," she whispered, her voice raspy. "She used them every night, until she didn't." I didn't ask more. I was drawn to them in a way I couldn't explain, so I bought them. As I left, I felt a strange chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. I was too excited to get them home and try them out. The first time I hung them up in the studio, I noticed something odd. They twisted slightly on their own, like a supple spiral that kept turning even after I secured them tightly. It was as if they were alive. But I laughed it off. I mean, I had seen silk do weird things in drafts, and with slight shifts in the air. When I climbed up, though, that's when I first heard it. A low, pulsing hum, almost like a heartbeat. It was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. The higher I climbed, the louder it got, until it seemed to vibrate through my entire body. My hands started to sweat, and I almost slipped, which was rare for me. But I shrugged it off again. Maybe it was the excitement of using new silks, or maybe I was just imagining things. The next few days were uneventful. I trained like usual, getting used to the new silks. But every time I practiced, I felt watched, like a pair of eyes were following my every move. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was nothing. A performer's nerves. But then, small things started happening. The silks would twist into complex knots overnight, no matter how neatly I tied them up before leaving. At first, I thought someone was playing a prank on me, but I was the only one with a key to the studio. One evening, I decided to stay late and see if I could catch whoever it was. I turned off the lights and hid behind the curtains, peeking out into the darkened studio. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up, I saw it. The silks, suspended from the ceiling, started to move on their own. They twisted and turned, forming intricate patterns that I'd never seen before. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, frozen in place. The hum began again, low and pulsing, almost like it was echoing in my skull. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, the silks stopped moving and hung still, swaying slightly as if taunting me. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, just a faint outline, curled around the base of the silks. It looked almost human but twisted, stretched unnaturally long. It seemed to merge with the fabric, becoming one with it. I blinked, and it was gone. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me. But from that night on, things got worse. Whenever I climbed the silks, they felt different. They weren't just fabric anymore. They were alive. I could feel them move under my hands, almost like they were breathing. The hum was louder too, throbbing in my ears, filling my mind with a strange, hypnotic rhythm. I started having nightmares. I'd dream of performing, the studio packed with people. But as I climbed higher and higher, I'd feel the silks tighten around me, wrapping me up, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart racing. Sometimes I'd wake to find myself tangled in the sheets, sweat-soaked and shaking. I tried to ignore it, to push through. I was a professional after all. But the silks wouldn't let me. One night, I stayed late again, determined to get through my routine. As I climbed, the hum grew louder, almost deafening. The silks twisted and turned under my hands, and I felt them pulling me up, higher and higher, until I was almost at the ceiling. Then, everything went silent. The hum stopped, the air still and heavy. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and a voice, barely a whisper, said, "She's watching." I lost my grip and fell, crashing onto the mat below. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs, and I lay there, staring up at the silks, which swayed gently above me. There was no one else in the studio, but I knew I wasn't alone. After that, I stopped using the silks. I couldn't bring myself to touch them. But every time I walked into the studio, they were there, hanging silently, like they were waiting. The air around them felt different, heavy and thick, and the hum was always there, just beneath the surface, like it was waiting for me to listen. I started asking around, trying to find out more about the performer the old woman had mentioned. No one seemed to know anything. It was like she never existed. I even went back to the flea market, but the woman was gone. Her stall was empty, the space where it stood covered in dust and cobwebs. That's when I knew I was in trouble. I began to notice things outside the studio too. I'd see shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, hear whispers in the dead of night. My phone would ring, but when I answered, there'd be nothing but static and that damn hum, low and throbbing. I couldn't sleep. I'd spend hours staring at the ceiling, waiting for the nightmares to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see the silks, twisting and writhing, reaching out for me. And then, one night, I had it. The hum coming from my living room. I got up, my heart pounding. The apartment was dark and silent, but the hum was there, filling the air, pulsing through the walls. I followed it, trembling, to the living room. There, hanging from the ceiling, were the silks. My silks, the ones I'd left locked up in the studio. They swayed gently in the still air, the crimson fabric glowing faintly in the darkness. I felt a cold breeze brush against my skin, and then I saw her. She was there, wrapped in the silks, her eyes dark and empty. Her face was twisted in a grotesque smile, her lips moving soundlessly. But I could hear her voice in my head, clear as day. "Come," she whispered. "It's time." I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The hum grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. The silks stretched out toward me, wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me closer and closer. I screamed, but no sound came out. I was trapped, caught in their grip, unable to move, to breathe. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was her face, smiling, her eyes shining with something dark and ancient. The last thing I heard was the hum, pulsing through my skull, and her voice whispering in my ear, "Now you're mine." I've always loved the beach. The sound of waves crashing, the smell of salt in the air, the endless horizon where the sky met the ocean. It all felt like freedom. As a kid, I spent countless hours building sandcastles, each one more elaborate than the last. That passion followed me into adulthood, and now I'm known around town as the sandcastle guy. Every summer, I'd scout the shoreline, looking for the perfect spot to create my next masterpiece. This year was no different, but something unusual happened. I found a patch of sand that, for some reason, never dried. It was strange, almost eerie. Even when the sun blazed down, or when the tide receded, the sand stayed damp and heavy, perfect for sculpting, but also unsettling. I remember the first time I noticed it. I was walking along the beach, the sun still low in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over everything. There was something about that spot, as if it called to me. The sand was darker, almost a deep shade of brown, compared to the surrounding golden hues. I didn't think much of it then, just figured it was the perfect place to start building. The first castle I made there was a simple one, just to get a feel for the sand. It was incredible how easily it molded, holding shapes that would have crumbled elsewhere. But then, just as I was putting the finishing touches on a turret, the whole thing collapsed. Not like it had fallen over, but like something invisible had struck it down, flattening it in a single swift movement. I laughed it off at first, assuming I'd misjudged the sand's stability. I tried again, this time more carefully. And again, as soon as I finished, the castle crumbled. This continued for hours. Every time I built something, no matter how small or intricate, it would collapse, as if an unseen hand was wiping it away. By sunset, I was frustrated and tired, and I decided to call it a day. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I returned every morning, determined to make a castle that would stand. But no matter what I did, the sand seemed cursed. It was maddening. I tried using different techniques, building simpler structures, but the result was always the same. It was as if the sand itself rejected my efforts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the beach grew quiet, I sat there staring at the empty patch of wet sand. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The sand was cold. Not the kind of cold you'd expect from dampness, but a chilling, bone-deep cold that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I shivered and decided to leave, but not before scooping some of the sand into a jar. I wanted to understand what was going on, even if I had to study it at home. That night, I had the most vivid dream. I was on the beach, building a castle on that very spot. but the sand beneath my hands felt different, almost alive. It squirmed and pulsed, like it was breathing. I tried to stand, but something held me down. I looked up, and there was a shadow, a dark figure looming over me, its face obscured. It reached out, and I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The jar of sand I'd taken home sat on my desk, looking innocent enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with it. I dumped it out onto a tray, spreading it thin, hoping to find something, anything that could explain the weirdness. But there was nothing, just ordinary grains of sand. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something terrible into my home. The following day, I decided to go back one last time, convinced I was overthinking things. Maybe I'd just been too focused on building the perfect castle, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I arrived early, the beach still empty and quiet. The strange patch of sand seemed to glisten in the morning light, beckoning me. I knelt down, running my fingers through it, feeling the cold seep into my skin. Determined, I started building again, and this time I whispered to the sand as I worked. "Please just let me build this one," I muttered, half jokingly. I crafted a small castle, nothing grand, just enough to test if the curse, or whatever it was, had lifted. For a moment, it stood. My heart leaped with excitement, but then, without warning, the entire structure caved in. It didn't just collapse. It sank, as if something beneath had swallowed it whole. I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat. And then I saw it, a faint imprint on the sand, like a giant handprint, pressing down where the castle had been. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scrambled to my feet. I wanted to leave, to run away and never look back, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the sand. The imprint faded, and the sand returned to its normal, undisturbed state. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and I knew I had to get out of there. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper carried by the wind. It sounded like my name. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The beach was empty, no one else around, and yet the whisper came again, closer this time. "Leave." It was a command, sharp and cold. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran, sprinting down the beach, my feet kicking up sand as I went. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. Whatever was on that beach, it didn't want me there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowy figure from my dream, felt its cold presence pressing down on me. I knew I should stay away, but something about the sand, about that spot, kept pulling me back. The next morning, I found myself driving to the beach again, against my better judgment. The air was thick with fog, the kind that made everything look surreal, almost dreamlike. I parked my car and walked to the beach, my feet moving on their own. The patch of wet sand was there, waiting for me, like it knew I would return. I stood there, staring at it, feeling a mix of fear and anger. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing across the empty beach. There was no answer, just the sound of the waves crashing in the distance. I dropped to my knees, pounding the sand with my fists. "Why won't you let me build?" The sand seemed to shift beneath me, almost as if it was laughing. I felt tears of frustration sting my eyes, but I refused to look away. "Show yourself," I yelled, daring whatever was there to face me. For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, the sand began to move. It swirled and twisted, rising up like a serpent. My heart pounded in my chest as the sand took shape, forming into a crude figure, a twisted, nightmarish version of the castles I'd tried to build. It loomed over me, featureless and terrifying, and I knew in that moment that I was dealing with something far beyond my understanding. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure raised an arm, pointing at me with a finger made of sand. I felt a force, like an invisible hand, shove me backward. I fell, my body hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through me, but I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking. "Why?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the roar of the ocean. The figure didn't answer, but I could feel its hatred, its anger radiating toward me like a physical force. I knew then that I had to leave, that if I stayed any longer, I wouldn't make it out alive. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The beach seemed to stretch on forever, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached my car, I jumped in and sped away, my heart racing. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the beach nothing but a distant memory. I never went back to that spot again. I tried to put it all behind me, but the nightmares never stopped. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that whisper echoing in my ears. Leave. I sold my house, moved inland, as far away from the ocean as I could. But even now, I can still feel it, the pull of the sand, the weight of that unseen hand. It's always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a reminder of the day I dared to challenge something beyond my control. And I know, deep down, that it's not over. Because sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the ocean calling my name. I've been in the upholstery business for almost 20 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Torn fabrics, stains that wouldn't budge, and even the occasional dead mouse hidden in the cushions. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found that day. It started with a call from an old client, Mrs. Harmon. She'd recently inherited a few pieces of furniture from her late aunt and wanted them reupholstered. When I arrived at her grand old house, I was struck by how quiet and eerie it felt, like the place hadn't been lived in for a long time. Mrs. Harmon greeted me warmly, her face lined with a mix of grief and something else I couldn't quite place. She led me to the drawing room, where the furniture was covered in dusty sheets. There was a settee, an armchair, and an ottoman. The pieces were well crafted but definitely in need of some care. As I lifted the sheet off the settee, Mrs. Harmon hesitated. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. My aunt was eccentric. She believed in all sorts of superstitions. She even said this fabric was cursed. I laughed it off. "I've heard weirder things. Don't worry, Mrs. Harmon. I'm sure it's just old tales. Let's see what we're working with." She nodded and watched as I started peeling back the layers of faded fabric. Underneath, I found a strange cloth I had never seen before. It was a deep, almost hypnotic shade of red, with patterns that seemed to swirl and shift under the dim light. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, a wave of warmth spread through my hand, almost like the fabric was alive. I pulled back instinctively and looked at Mrs. Harmon. Her face had gone pale. "See what I mean?" she murmured. "Must be some kind of insulation effect," I muttered, trying to reassure myself as much as her. But something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way the patterns moved, almost like they were breathing, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to take the fabric back to my workshop. I convinced myself that maybe I was just tired, seeing things that weren't there. But as I worked on the settee over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fabric was watching me. Every time I looked at it, the pattern seemed different. At first it was subtle, a line that curved slightly more than before or a swirl that appeared out of nowhere. But soon it became more obvious. One evening, as I was stitching a piece onto the settee, I noticed a shape that hadn't been there before. It was faint, but unmistakable, a face, hidden among the intricate designs. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was gone. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You're losing it, old man," I muttered to myself. But the face wasn't the end of it. Each time I came back to the fabric, there were more shapes. Hands reaching out, eyes staring, mouths open in silent screams. It was like the fabric was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand what. The warmth that had once been a mild curiosity now felt oppressive, like a fever that wouldn't break. I considered telling Mrs. Harmon about it, but what could I say? That her dead aunt's fabric was haunted. She'd think I was crazy. So I kept working, hoping that once the pieces were finished, the feeling would go away. The first piece I finished was the settee. The moment I placed the final stitch, the warmth surged through the fabric, radiating outwards like a heatwave. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The faces in the patterns seemed to shift, their expressions turning from desperation to something almost like relief. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I must be exhausted, that's all. I decided to call it a day and left the workshop, but even as I drove home, I could still feel the warmth of the fabric on my skin. That night, I dreamt of the settee. It was standing in the middle of my workshop, the patterns swirling faster and faster until they became a blur. And then, out of the chaos, the faces emerged, their eyes locked on me. They were whispering, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. All I could feel was their fear, their pain, and something else, a hunger. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It was just a dream, I told myself, just a dream. The next morning, I went back to the workshop, determined to finish the job and get rid of that cursed fabric once and for all. I started working on the armchair, but the moment I touched the fabric, the warmth flared up, almost burning. I yanked my hand back, staring at the cloth in horror. The faces were back, but this time they weren't just shapes in the fabric. They were clearer, more defined. I could see their eyes, their mouths twisted in agony. I knew then that I had to get rid of it. I grabbed a pair of scissors and started cutting the fabric away, but as soon as the blades touched it, a high-pitched scream echoed through the workshop. I dropped the scissors, my hands shaking. The fabric wasn't just warm anymore. It was hot, like it was alive. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What the hell was I dealing with? I had to call Mrs. Harmon, tell her to take the furniture back, burn it, do something. But before I could reach for my phone, the settee moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift, but I saw it. The legs creaked, and then it slid forward an inch, then another. The faces in the fabric seemed to pulse with excitement, their eyes following me as I backed away. I reached the door, my hand fumbling for the handle, but before I could open it, the settee shot forward, slamming into me and knocking me to the ground. I lay there, stunned, as the settee loomed over me, the fabric burning hot against my skin. I could feel the faces pressing into me, their mouths moving silently, their eyes wide with hunger. I struggled, trying to push it off, but it was too heavy, too strong. Then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the settee pulled back, settling back on its legs as if nothing had happened. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath. The warmth was gone, replaced by a bone-chilling cold. The faces were still there, but they were different now. Satisfied. Content. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the workshop, not stopping until I was in my car, the engine running. I sat there, shaking, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was no sense to it. The fabric was cursed, alive, and it had almost killed me. I drove straight to Mrs. Harmon's house, my mind racing. I had to warn her, tell her to get rid of that fabric, that furniture, anything that had touched it. But when I arrived, her house was dark and silent. I pounded on the door, shouting her name, but there was no answer. I was about to leave when I noticed something through the window. The settee. It was sitting in the middle of her living room, the faces in the fabric staring out at me. And there, slumped over the back, was Mrs. Harmon, her eyes wide open, her skin pale and cold. She was dead. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How had it gotten here? I had locked the workshop, hadn't I? But even as the question swelled in my head, I knew the answer. The fabric had wanted to come back, to finish what it had started. I ran to my car and drove away, not stopping until I was miles from that cursed house. I don't know what happened to the fabric or the furniture. I never went back to my workshop. I couldn't. I left everything behind, hoping that whatever curse was in that fabric would stay there. But sometimes, late at night, I can still feel the warmth on my skin, hear the whispers in the dark. I know it's out there waiting, and one day it will find me. And this time, there will be no escape. I've been making windows for over 30 years. It's a straightforward job, really. You measure, cut, fit, and repeat. There's a certain satisfaction in it, knowing that your work becomes a literal window into someone's world. I thought I'd seen it all until I came across that pane of glass. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. I was rummaging through a stack of old supplies in the workshop, looking for something I could use for a custom order. That's when I found it, tucked away in a dusty corner. The glass was different, slightly thicker than the others, with a faint shimmer when held to the light. It seemed to almost hum with an energy I couldn't quite place. I decided to clean it up and see if it was still usable. Once it was free of dust and grime, I held it up to the window to inspect it. That's when I noticed the oddest thing. The image it showed wasn't quite right. My workshop window overlooked the small street outside, usually quiet except for the occasional car or pedestrian. But through this glass, the street seemed more alive, vibrant almost. I frowned, adjusting my grip, thinking I was just tired. But the more I looked, the more I realized something was off. A man walked past the shop, and I could see him through both the actual window and the pane I was holding. Only, in the glass, he was walking faster, like someone had pressed fast forward on a remote. He turned the corner in real life, but in the glass, he'd already disappeared from view a second before. My heart thudded in my chest. I set the glass down and blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. Maybe it was a trick of the light or just my imagination running wild, but curiosity got the better of me. I propped the glass up against the window and watched for a few more minutes. Everything outside moved normally, but in the glass, it was like watching a sped-up version of reality. I told myself it was a quirk of the glass, maybe some distortion due to the thickness or the way it was cut. But the more I watched, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing something else, something wrong. I should have left it alone. I really should have. Instead, I decided to take it home. I thought it would make an interesting conversation piece, maybe even a unique addition to my collection of oddities. My wife, Marie, wasn't too thrilled about it. She's always been a bit superstitious, and the moment she saw the glass, she got this look on her face. "There's something off about that thing," she muttered, refusing to even touch it. "It's just a piece of glass, Marie," I said, trying to laugh off her concerns. "I've seen 100 like it." "No, you haven't," she replied, eyes narrowed. And I wanted out of the house. We'd argued for a bit, but I was stubborn. I didn't believe in all that supernatural nonsense. I set the glass up in the spare room, propped against the wall opposite the window. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. It just sat there, reflecting the room back at me like any other mirror. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me through it. It was subtle at first, just a fleeting sensation of being observed. Then, I started noticing the reflection again. When I'd walk past, I could see myself moving just a fraction of a second faster in the glass. It was unsettling, like seeing a ghost of myself lingering a heartbeat ahead. But it wasn't until I saw Marie in the reflection that I realized how bad things were getting. One night, I was passing by the spare room when I caught a glimpse of her in the glass. She was standing there, staring right at me. Only she wasn't standing in the room. I turned around quickly, and the room was empty. But when I looked back at the glass, there she was, frozen in the act of walking toward me. I stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I called out to her, my voice trembling. She came rushing from the kitchen, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong?" I pointed at the glass, my hand shaking. You were in there." Marie took one look at the glass and turned pale. "Get rid of it, now." I wanted to, I really did. But something stopped me, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I felt like I needed to understand what this thing was, why it was showing me these twisted images of reality. So I started watching it more closely. I'd spend hours in the spare room, staring at the glass as it showed me a world just slightly out of sync with mine. People outside moved faster, their reflections a step ahead, like they were living in a future I couldn't quite reach. Then, one night, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was me. I was walking down the hallway, heading toward the kitchen. I watched, frozen, as my reflection reached the door and paused, turning back to look directly at me. It grinned, a twisted, knowing smile that didn't belong on my face. I turned and ran down the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the kitchen, but there was no one there. My reflection was still in the spare room, staring out of the glass with that awful smile. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I think I screamed. Marie found me huddled in the corner of the room, shaking uncontrollably. I tried to tell her what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. She didn't wait for an explanation. She just dragged me out of there and locked the door. We left the house that night, staying at a hotel. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the image of my own face, grinning at me with a malice I didn't understand. The next day, I tried to convince Marie to let me go back, to destroy the glass once and for all, but she wouldn't let me near the house. We called a friend of mine, an old carpenter, and asked him to remove it. He said he'd take care of it, and I hoped that would be the end of it. A few days later, he called me, his voice trembling. "You need to come here," he said, barely able to get the words out. "There's something wrong with that glass." Against Marie's protests, I drove over. When I got there, I found him standing outside, pale as a ghost. He led me inside, not saying a word, just pointing at the glass. It was shattered, pieces lying all over the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the reflection in each shard. It showed the room as it had been, with everything in its place. Except for one thing. I was in the reflection, standing in the middle of the room, staring right at us. My reflection's eyes followed us as we moved, a silent observer in a broken world. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I think I blacked out. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, Marie by my side. She told me they'd found me unconscious in the house, surrounded by shattered glass. The doctors said I'd gone into shock. I tried to explain, but no one believed me. They said it was just stress, that I'd imagined it all. But I know what I saw. That glass showed me something that shouldn't exist, a reality twisted and broken, just like the shards left behind. We moved away after that. I left the business, couldn't bring myself to even look at another window. But sometimes, late at night, I still see that reflection in my mind's eye, grinning back at me from a world just a fraction out of reach. And I wonder if one day I'll see it again. Only this time, it won't be in the glass. It'll be standing right in front of me. I've been a plumber for over 15 years, and in that time, I thought I'd seen it all. Burst pipes flooding basements, tree roots tearing through sewer lines, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what I found in that old house on Maple Street. It was a slow Tuesday when the call came in. The voice on the other end was shaky, almost desperate. There's a pipe in my basement that won't stop tripping. I've tried everything. Can you come and take a look? I'd handled countless leaky pipes before, so I thought this would be a quick fix. I threw my tools in the truck and headed over. The house itself was a creaky old thing, probably built in the early 1900s. Paint was peeling off the walls, and the yard looked like it hadn't seen a mower in years. It was the kind of place that gave off an unsettling vibe, even in broad daylight. Mrs. Dawson, the homeowner, was waiting for me at the door. She was a frail woman, probably in her 70s, with a worried look on her face. "It's in the basement," she said, leading me down a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. In the corner, a single pipe ran along the ceiling, dripping slowly onto the concrete floor below. I could hear the drip echoing in the silence. Drip. 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 Mrs. Dawson pointed at the pipe, her hands trembling. I've had other plumbers look at it, but no one can stop it. And that stain, it keeps growing. I followed her gaze to the floor beneath the pipe. There was a black stain, almost like an ink blot, spreading slowly across the concrete. It looked wrong. Not like water damage or mold, but something else entirely. I set my tools down and climbed up to inspect the pipe. The valve was completely turned off, yet the water kept dripping. I unscrewed the valve and checked inside, dry as a bone. There was no reason for water to be leaking from it, but there it was, drop by drop, falling onto the floor below. "Must be a problem with the pressure," I muttered, though I didn't believe it myself. I tightened the valve and put some tape around it, hoping that would at least slow the drip. But it didn't. The drops kept coming, slow and steady, forming a small puddle that seeped into the stain below. I glanced at Mrs. Dawson. She was staring at the stain, her eyes wide with fear. "It's been growing, hasn't it?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Every night, it spreads a little more. I've tried cleaning it, scrubbing it, but nothing works. It always comes back." I didn't know what to say. I'd never seen anything like it, but I wasn't about to let a stubborn pipe get the best of me. I climbed down, grabbed my wrench, and decided to take the whole section apart. As I worked, Mrs. Dawson stood in the corner, wringing her hands. "Did something happen in this house?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She hesitated. "My husband, he passed away a few years ago. He used to work down here, fixing things, tinkering. After he died, the dripping started. I thought it was just an old house settling, but it's been getting worse." I nodded, though her story didn't explain the stain or the relentless drip. I managed to get the pipe off, holding it up to the light. It was old, but there were no cracks, no signs of corrosion. I put it back together, sealing it tight, and waited. For a moment, the dripping stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I'd finally fixed it. But then, as if mocking me, a single drop fell from the pipe and landed on the stain below. I cursed under my breath. This wasn't normal. There was something wrong with this house, with this pipe. I looked closer at the stain. It was almost oily, shimmering slightly in the dim light. I touched it with my glove, and it felt cold, like ice. I pulled back, a shiver running down my spine. Something about this didn't feel right. I'll need to come back with some more tools, I lied, eager to get out of that basement. Maybe bring a colleague. We'll figure this out. Mrs. Dawson just nodded, her eyes never leaving the stain. I packed up my things and left, promising to return the next day. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept thinking about the house, the pipe, and that black stain. It haunted my dreams, spreading slowly across the floor, creeping toward the walls, the ceiling, until it swallowed everything in darkness. The next morning, I called my buddy Jim, another plumber with more experience in old houses. We drove back to Maple Street together, armed with every tool we could think of. Mrs. Dawson let us in, her face pale and drawn. "It's worse," she whispered as we made our way to the basement. When we got down there, I could see what she meant. The stain had spread across the entire floor, a slick, black pool that seemed to pulse and shimmer in the light. The pipe was still dripping, a steady, relentless beat that echoed in the silence. Drip, drip, drip. Jim looked at me, his face pale. "What the hell is this?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to figure it out." We spent hours in that basement, taking the pipe apart piece by piece, checking every valve, every connection. There was no reason for it to be leaking, and yet it was. And the stain, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. It wasn't just water damage, it was something else, something alive. As we worked, I could feel a pressure building in the room, a sense of dread that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at Mrs. Dawson. She was standing in the corner, watching us with hollow eyes. "It's him," she whispered suddenly. "It's my husband. He's angry." Jim and I exchanged a look. "Ma'am, I don't think." I started, but she cut me off. "He used to say he'd never leave this house. He spent so much time down here, fixing things, making sure everything was perfect. But after he died, things started going wrong. The lights would flicker, the floors would creak, and then the dripping started. It's like he's still here, trying to fix things, but he can't." I didn't know what to say. I didn't believe in ghosts, but there was something about that house, about that basement, that made me wonder. Jim shook his head. "Look, we're just plumbers. We don't deal with whatever this is." I nodded, agreeing. "We can try to seal the pipe again, but I don't know if it'll help." We did what we could, tightening every valve, sealing every joint, but the dripping didn't stop. It just kept coming, slow and steady, drop by drop. And the stain, it was spreading faster now, reaching the walls, climbing up them like vines. "We need to leave," Jim said suddenly, his voice tight with fear. "There's something wrong here." I didn't argue. We packed up our tools and headed for the stairs. Mrs. Dawson stayed behind, staring at the stain as if mesmerized. "Ma'am, you should come with us," I said, but she just shook her head. "I can't leave him," she whispered. "He's still here. He's not done yet." I didn't understand, but I knew we had to get out. Jim and I left, driving away in silence. I glanced back at the house once, and I thought I saw something moving in the basement window, a shadow shifting in the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I kept seeing the stain, the way it shimmered and pulsed, the way it seemed to crawl across the floor. I knew I had to go back to see if Mrs. Dawson was okay. The next day, I drove back to Maple Street alone. The house was silent, the door slightly ajar. I called out, but there was no answer. My heart pounding, I made my way down to the basement. The stain was everywhere now, covering the walls, the ceiling, everything. And in the center of the room, lying in the middle of that black pool, was Mrs. Dawson. She was still, her eyes open, staring up at the ceiling. I stepped closer, my heart in my throat. Her mouth was moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. I leaned in, trying to make out the words. "It's done," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "He's finished." And then, with a final, shuddering breath, she went still. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the smell of mold and something else, something dark and foul. I ran, tripping over my own feet as I fled up the stairs and out of the house. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was in my truck, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No body, no stain, no dripping pipe. The basement was empty, just a dusty old room filled with junk. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I know what I saw. I know what happened in that house. I quit plumbing after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the darkness from that basement had seeped into my soul. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the dripping, slow and steady, echoing in the silence. Drip, drip, drip. And I know, deep down, that some things can't be fixed. When you've been tinting windows as long as I have, you start to think you've seen it all. Every kind of film, every type of customer. But that was before I found the box. A plain, dusty cardboard box shoved in the back corner of my shop, covered in old receipts and scraps of material. I almost missed it. I wish I had. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and business was slow. I decided to do a bit of cleaning, which, if you know me, is rare. I was sifting through the mess when I spotted it. The box looked ancient, like it had been sitting there for decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it out, brushing off the dust. Inside, I found several rolls of window film, but one of them was different. The film was a deep, iridescent purple, and when I held it up to the light, it shimmered strangely, almost like it was alive. I'd never seen anything like it before. There was no brand name, no indication of where it came from. Just the film and a note attached to the inside of the box. Use with caution. Now, I'm not superstitious or anything, but something about that note gave me chills. I laughed it off though. A window film with a warning label? Seemed more like a marketing gimmick. But the thing is, I couldn't stop looking at it. It was mesmerizing, the way the light played off its surface. I decided then and there that I had to try it out. My first test was on a small office downtown. The client wanted privacy, and I figured this purple film would do the trick. As soon as I started applying it, I noticed something odd. The room seemed to get quieter, not just because I was focused, but almost like the sound was being sucked out of the air. And then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whine. It was so subtle at first that I thought I was imagining it. But as I smoothed out the film, the sound grew louder, sharper, like someone was running their finger along the rim of a crystal glass. I finished up and stepped back. The room looked amazing. The film gave the glass a sleek, mysterious look, but the whine persisted, lingering in the background. The client seemed pleased enough though, and didn't mention the noise, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. Over the next few weeks, I found myself using that purple film more and more. It was like I was drawn to it, even though the high-pitched whine came back every time I applied it. Each time, it got a little louder, a little more unbearable. I started getting headaches, sharp pains that would strike out of nowhere and linger for hours. But the clients never complained, so I kept going. One day, I got a call from a wealthy couple who had just bought a huge old mansion on the outskirts of town. They wanted all the windows tinted for privacy and heat control, and they were willing to pay top dollar. I knew exactly what film I was going to use. When I arrived at the mansion, I was struck by how isolated it was. Surrounded by dense woods, the place had an unsettling atmosphere. The couple greeted me warmly enough, but I noticed how their eyes seemed to flicker with unease when I brought out the purple film. They didn't say anything though, and I got to work. The first window I applied it to was in the grand living room. As soon as I smoothed the film over the glass, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I could see my breath puffing out in little white clouds, even though it was the middle of summer. And then that whine started again, piercing and relentless. It was so loud now that I could barely concentrate, but I forced myself to keep going. As I moved from room to room, the noise followed me, growing more intense with each window I covered. By the time I reached the top floor, it was like a scream, high and shrill, vibrating in my skull. I could feel it in my teeth, my bones. It was like the whole house was vibrating with that awful sound. I was just about to finish the last window in the master bedroom when something strange happened. The film wouldn't stick. It was like the glass was rejecting it, pushing it away. Frustrated, I pressed harder, but it was no use. The film crumpled and tore in my hands. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the window, there was something behind me. A shadow, dark and twisted, looming over me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. My heart was pounding and my head felt like it was going to split open from the noise. I stumbled back, hitting the window with my shoulder. The glass cracked. In that instant, the high-pitched whine exploded into a deafening roar. The room spun and I fell to the floor, clutching my ears. I could feel something seeping into my mind, cold and malevolent, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. I don't know how long I lay there, writhing in pain, but when I finally opened my eyes, the room was dark and the couple was standing over me, their faces twisted in concern. "Are you all right?" the woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, too shaken to speak. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and left without saying another word. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house, bathed in that eerie purple glow, like it was pulsing with some kind of dark energy. That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. I was back at the mansion, standing in front of the last window, but the shadow was there, solid and real. It reached out for me with long, spindly fingers, and I could hear that whine, louder than ever, drilling into my skull. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The headaches didn't go away. They got worse. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't think. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, felt it reaching for me. And the whine, that horrible whine, was always there in the back of my mind, driving me mad. I tried to get rid of the film. I burned it, buried it, threw it in the river, but every morning it was back in the shop, pristine and perfect, like it had never been touched. I knew then that I was cursed, bound to that terrible thing. It was inside me, warming its way into my soul, feeding off my fear. I stopped taking jobs, stopped leaving the house. I couldn't risk spreading that evil to anyone else, but it didn't matter. The whine followed me everywhere, in my dreams, in my waking hours, a constant, unrelenting torment. And then, one night, I heard a knock at the door. I knew who it was before I even opened it. The couple from the mansion, their faces pale and drawn, eyes sunken and hollow. They didn't say anything, just stared at me with that same flickering unease. "We need more film," the man said finally, his voice trembling. I slammed the door in their faces and locked myself in the bathroom, my heart racing. I could hear them outside, scratching at the walls, whispering my name. The whine was louder than ever, a scream in my mind, and I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. I'm writing this now because I don't know how much time I have left. The shadow is here, I can feel it, pressing against my mind, whispering dark things in that high-pitched voice. It's calling me back to the mansion, back to where it all started. I know I can't resist it much longer. If you're reading this, if you find that film, burn it, destroy it, do whatever you can. Don't let it take you too, because once it has you, there's no getting away. You'll be trapped, just like me, lost in that awful purple glow. And the worst part is, you'll hear it forever. That terrible high-pitched whine. I've been a private investigator for over 15 years now, working out of a cramped office in a quiet part of town. It's not the most glamorous job, but it keeps the lights on and gives me something to do. You get to see the best and worst of people, though it's mostly the worst. People come to me with all sorts of problems. Cheating spouses, missing kids, stolen property. You name it, I've probably handled it. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found last week. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon. The kind of day where the clouds seemed to press down on the city, making everything feel heavy. My feet were up on the desk, the ashtray full, and the coffee in my cup long cold. I was just about to call it a day when my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Is this James Carson?" The voice on the other end was thin and reedy, like someone who hadn't used it much recently. "Speaking. Who's asking?" "My name is Alice Morris. I found something that might interest you." People say things like that all the time. Usually it's a wild goose chase, some old lady thinking she saw Elvis in her backyard. But something about her tone made me sit up straighter. I could hear the urgency in her voice. "What is it?" "It's a missing persons file from 30 years ago. I think you should see it." I frowned. "Look, lady, I'm not a cop. I don't handle cold cases." "Please," she interrupted, her voice almost pleading. "Just come and take a look." I'm at the old library on Maple Street. It's important." Before I could say anything else, she hung up. I stared at the phone for a moment, feeling uneasy. The old library on Maple had been closed for years, left to decay like a forgotten relic. Why would someone be there? Despite my reservations, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my coat and headed out. The rain was coming down in sheets by the time I reached the library, its tall, Gothic architecture looming out of the mist like something from a horror movie. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung ajar, creaking on its rusty hinges. I stepped inside, the musty smell of old books and dampness hitting me like a wall. The place was a mess. Piles of books scattered across the floor, dust hanging in the air. I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. "Alice?" Over here came the faint reply from somewhere deeper inside. I followed the sound, my footsteps crunching on the debris. I found her in what used to be the records room, hunched over a table with a single lamp illuminating the space. She looked up as I approached, and I saw that she was older than I'd imagined, late 60s maybe. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed me a folder. "Take a look," she said. I opened the folder, expecting to see the usual, a grainy photo, a description of the missing person, last known whereabouts. But when I saw the picture, my blood ran cold. It was me. Not just someone who looked like me, but me. Same brown hair, same crooked nose, same scar above my left eyebrow. I flipped through the file, my heart hammering in my chest. The name on the file was James Carson. Date of birth, my date of birth. Last seen in 1993, 30 years ago. My hands were shaking now. This had to be some kind of joke. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, looking up at her. She shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I found it while going through the old archives. No one's been down here in years." I turned back to the file, trying to make sense of it. According to the report, I had disappeared one evening without a trace. There were interviews with people I didn't recognize, statements from family members I didn't have. But the details, they were so familiar. My old apartment, my favorite bar, even the name of my dog back then. "This is insane," I muttered, flipping through the pages. "I'm standing right here. I've never been missing." She just watched me, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Are you sure?" "What kind of question is that?" I snapped, slamming the folder shut. Of course I'm sure. But as the words left my mouth, a flicker of doubt crept in. I tried to remember that year, 1993, but it was hazy, like looking through a fog-up window. I remembered school, my parents, getting my first job. But there were gaps, weeks and months that seemed to blur together. "You need to leave this alone," Alice said softly, as if she could see the thoughts racing through my mind. "Some things are better left buried." But I couldn't just walk away. I took the file and left the library without another word, my mind spinning. Back at the office, I spread the contents out on my desk, staring at them for hours. The more I read, the more confused I became. How could this be? I'd never been missing. I had a life, a career. I was me. But then the dream started. It was the same every night. I'd find myself standing in a dark, empty field, the moon high and full above me. There was a house in the distance, old and crumbling, its windows dark. And I knew, without knowing how, that I had to go inside. My legs would carry me forward, even though every part of me screamed to turn back. The door would creak open, and I'd step inside. The smell of mold and rot was overpowering, and the darkness seemed to press in on me, suffocating. I'd hear footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, and I knew I had to follow. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs, the boards creaking under my weight. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors that stretched into the darkness. But one door at the very end was slightly ajar. I'd push it open, my hand trembling, and step inside. And that's when I'd see it. Myself. Standing in front of an old mirror, the reflection staring back at me with empty eyes. It was me, but older. Hollow. And every night it would raise a hand, pointing towards the mirror. I'd feel a pull, like I was being sucked into the glass, and then I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dreams became more vivid, more real. I started waking up in strange places, my car, the middle of the street, once even outside that damn library. I was losing time, whole hours slipping away without me noticing. And then, one night, I found something that made my blood run cold. I'd woken up in the middle of the night, the dream still fresh in my mind. But when I turned on the light, there was mud on my shoes, dirt under my fingernails. My hands were scratched and raw, like I'd been digging. I stumbled into the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. That's when I saw it. A note taped to the glass, in my own handwriting. "Come find me." My knees buckled, and I had to grip the sink to steady myself. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I tore the note off, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The words bled together as I tried to make sense of them. I needed help. I needed answers. I went back to the library, but Alice was gone. The place was locked up tight, the windows dark. I called the number she'd used, but it was disconnected. It was like she never existed. I spent the next few days digging through my own past, trying to find something, anything that would explain what was happening. I reached out to old friends, colleagues, anyone who might remember me from that time. But every call, every conversation left me more confused. No one remembered me from before 1993. It was like I just appeared one day, fully formed, with no past. I tried calling my parents, but the line went straight to voicemail. I drove to their house, but it was empty, the windows boarded up. Neighbors said they'd moved years ago, but they couldn't remember when. The more I searched, the less I found. I was unraveling, coming apart at the seams. I started seeing things, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, figures standing at the edge of my vision. My reflection in the mirror would flicker like a bad TV signal, distorting and warping. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was afraid to close my eyes, afraid of what I'd see. And then one night I had it. A knock at the door. It was late, the city outside quiet and still. I sat frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling, and made my way to the door. I peered through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. But then I saw it, lying on the doormat. An envelope, yellowed with age. My name was scrawled across it in that same familiar handwriting. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and tore it open. Inside was a single photograph. It was me, standing in front of that old house from my dreams. The one I'd never seen before in my life, yet knew as well as my own reflection. And scrawled on the back were 2 words that sent a shiver down my spine. "Welcome home." I dropped the photo like it had burned me, my mind racing. I had to go. I had to find that house. I didn't know why, didn't know what I'd find there, but I had no choice. I grabbed my coat and keys and drove through the night, the city blurring past me. It took hours, but I found it. A forgotten road, hidden deep in the woods, leading to a place that shouldn't exist. The house loomed out of the darkness, exactly like in my dreams. Old, crumbling, the windows dark and empty. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting into my skin. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, whispering to me, drawing me closer. I walked up the steps, the wood creaking under my weight, and pushed open the door. It was just like I remembered. The smell of mold and rot, the darkness pressing in around me. I could hear the footsteps above, slow and deliberate, and I knew what I had to do. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway stretched out before me, long and narrow, the doors lining it like sentinels. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the end, the door slightly ajar, and pushed it open. There it was. The mirror. My reflection stared back at me, hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. I stepped closer, my hands trembling, reaching out. The glass was cold under my fingers, and as I looked into it, I saw something shift behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, my reflection distorting, warping, the face changing. It was older, the skin pale and drawn, the eyes sunken and dark. It looked like me, but it wasn't. And then it smiled. The glass shattered, the sound deafening in the silence. I stumbled back, falling to the floor, my heart racing. When I looked up, the mirror was whole again, the reflection gone. I stood slowly, my legs shaking, and reached out to touch it. My hand passed through. It was like stepping through a sheet of ice. I felt a cold so intense it burned, and then I was falling, tumbling through darkness. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. I lay there for a moment, gasping, before I pushed myself up. I was in the field, the one from my dreams. The house loomed before me, old and crumbling, the windows dark. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I knew what I had to do. I walked up to the door and pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay, the darkness pressing in around me. I could hear the footsteps above, slow and deliberate. I climbed the stairs, my heart steady, my mind clear. The hallway stretched out before me, long and narrow, the doors lining it like sentinels. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the end, the door slightly ajar, and pushed it open. There it was, the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. But this time, I didn't turn away. I stepped closer, my hands trembling, reaching out. The glass was cold under my fingers, and as I looked into it, I saw something shift behind me. I turned, and there I was, standing in the doorway watching. The reflection, the other me, the one from the file. The one who'd been missing for 30 years. "Welcome home," he said, his voice a hollow echo of my own. And then everything went dark. I woke up back in my office, the morning sun streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare born from too much stress and too little sleep. But then I saw the folder on my desk, the photograph lying on top. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and turned it over. The words were still there, scrawled in my own handwriting. "Welcome home." I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I'm the real James Carson or just a reflection, a shadow of a life that was lost. But I do know one thing. I'm not alone anymore. Every time I look in the mirror, he's there, watching, waiting. And one day, he'll step through. And this time, I won't be able to stop him. I've been teaching for over a decade now, and while the job has its fair share of challenges, I've always found solace in the routine. The beginning of each school year brings fresh faces, new names to learn, and a chance to connect with students who might just need that one teacher to believe in them. This year started just like any other, until I noticed something unusual. It was the second week of September, and I was going through the attendance sheet, calling out names, one by one, as I always do. I had barely glanced up from the sheet, my eyes following the familiar rhythm of names and responses. That's when I noticed him, Daniel Harrow. He was sitting quietly at the back, his head slightly tilted as if deep in thought, just like he always used to. I felt a pang of recognition, an inexplicable sense of familiarity, and then it hit me like a punch to the gut. Daniel Harrow had died 3 years ago. My mind raced, heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be him. It was impossible. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and when I opened them again, he was gone. I shook my head, embarrassed by my own lapse in judgment. It must have been a trick of the light, or maybe I was just tired. After all, it had been a long day, and grief has a strange way of playing tricks on you. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that followed me for the rest of the day. The next day, I found myself scanning the classroom more carefully, almost nervously, as if expecting to see him again. And there he was. This time, I couldn't dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. Daniel was sitting in the exact same seat, staring ahead, not making a sound. His eyes were vacant, hollow, like he was there but not really present. My hands trembled as I called out the names. When I reached his, my voice cracked. "Daniel Harrow?" I don't know why I said it. It was a stupid, instinctive thing, something I regretted the moment the words left my mouth. The room fell silent, and I could feel all the eyes of my students on me. I forced a smile, stammering, "Sorry, that was a mistake." No one seemed to notice my slip-up, but I could feel my pulse quicken as I glanced back at the seat. Empty again. The bell rang, and the students shuffled out, oblivious to the turmoil in my mind. I stayed back, staring at that empty seat, wondering if I was losing my mind. Was this some cruel joke? Or was my grief for Daniel, whom I had taught for 2 years before his tragic accident, resurfacing in a way I couldn't control? I decided to keep it to myself. Maybe it was just stress, but as the days passed, I saw him more frequently, every day at the same time, in the same seat. He never moved, never spoke, just sat there, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. I started avoiding looking in that direction, but it didn't help. I knew he was there, and the weight of his presence was suffocating. Then came the whispers. It started with one of the students, a quiet girl named Emily. She stayed behind after class one day, fidgeting nervously. "Mr. Green, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Emily. What is it?" She glanced at the empty seat, then back at me. "Who's the boy sitting at the back?" "I've seen him a few times, but no one talks to him." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I saw him yesterday too, but he's not in our class, is he?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. "There's no one there, Emily. Maybe you're just imagining things." She frowned, clearly unconvinced, but nodded and left the room. My heart was racing now. If she had seen him too, then this wasn't just in my head. I spent the weekend combing through old records, anything that could explain what was happening. I pulled out the yearbook from 3 years ago, the year Daniel died. His smiling face stared back at me, the same face I had seen in the classroom, only now it looked more alive than what I had been witnessing. I reached out to a few colleagues, subtly bringing up Daniel in conversation. Most of them remembered him fondly, but brushed off my concerns about his presence. "It's normal to think about past students," they said, "especially when you've been doing this job as long as you have." I wasn't satisfied. I knew something was wrong, something that went beyond my own grief or memories. I found myself driving to the cemetery where Daniel was buried. His grave was there, a small, modest stone with his name engraved on it. I felt a wave of sorrow and confusion wash over me. If he was here, then who, or what, was sitting in my classroom? I didn't have any answers, just more questions and a growing sense of dread that clung to me like a shadow. The following Monday, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I stayed back after class, waiting until the last student had left. I sat down in my chair, staring at the empty seat where Daniel had been. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The room was silent, eerily so. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow. Then, slowly, the air seemed to thicken, and a faint outline began to form in the seat. It was him, Daniel. But his form was translucent, barely there, like a reflection on a foggy mirror. "What do you want?" I asked again, louder this time, my fear giving way to a desperate need for answers. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I leaned forward, straining to hear. "Help me," he mouthed, his voice barely a whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "How?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What can I do?" But before he could answer, he faded away, leaving the room cold and empty once more. I sat there, stunned, my mind reeling. What did he mean? How could I help him? And more importantly, what was keeping him here? Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I searched through old newspapers, trying to find any clue, anything that could explain why Daniel was still lingering. I learned that his death had been ruled an accident, a car crash late at night. But there were whispers, rumors that it hadn't been an accident at all. Some said he had been running from something. Others claimed he had seen something that had terrified him. I started to piece together a disturbing picture. Daniel had been acting strangely before his death, skipping classes, showing up late, looking over his shoulder as if he was being watched. I had noticed it too back then, but I had brushed it off as typical teenage angst. Now, I wasn't so sure. I began to feel watched myself. At night, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows darting just out of sight. My phone would ring with no one on the other end, and I would find things in my house moved around, little things like books or cups, as if someone had been there. I was spiraling, my sleep plagued with nightmares of Daniel, his face twisted in fear, reaching out to me for help. I knew I was getting close to something, but I didn't know what. It was a stormy night when I finally found the piece of the puzzle I had been missing. I was in the school library, sifting through old files, when I stumbled upon a report I had never seen before. It was an anonymous letter sent to the principal just days before Daniel's death. It spoke of a secret, something Daniel knew that had put him in danger. It warned that if he spoke to anyone, he would be silenced. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was it. This was what had kept him trapped, what had prevented him from moving on. I didn't know what to do. Should I go to the police? But what could I say? That I was seeing the ghost of a dead student who needed help solving his own murder. They would think I was crazy. And maybe I was. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to do something. The next day, I went to the principal's office. I showed him the letter, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found. He listened quietly, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a strange look in his eyes. I had hoped this would never come up again, he said, his voice low. I thought it was all buried with him. What are you talking about? I demanded, my heart racing. He sighed, looking older than I had ever seen him. Daniel knew something he shouldn't have. He was going to go to the police, but, well, someone made sure he didn't. I felt the ground shift beneath me. You're saying he was killed? He nodded slowly. I didn't know at the time, but I found out later. It was too late by then. The person responsible is long gone. My mind was spinning. Why didn't you do anything? He looked at me, his eyes full of regret. What could I do? There was no proof, and the people involved were powerful. I felt sick. This was what Daniel had been trying to tell me. This was why he was still here, trapped, unable to move on. What do I do now? I whispered, feeling helpless. He looked at me with sad eyes. There's nothing you can do. It's over. But I knew he was wrong. It wasn't over. Not for Daniel. I went back to my classroom, my mind racing with everything I had learned. I felt a heavy weight in my chest, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I sat down in my chair, staring at the empty seat at the back. Daniel, I whispered, my voice cracking. I'm so sorry. And then he was there, sitting in his usual spot, his eyes fixed on me. He looked sad, almost peaceful, as if he knew I had finally understood. I can't help you, I said, tears streaming down my face. I don't know how. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with those empty eyes, and then he was gone. The next morning, I found out that the principal had died in his sleep. The news shook the school, but I couldn't help but wonder if it was a coincidence, or if Daniel had finally gotten his revenge. The sightings stopped after that. Daniel never appeared in my classroom again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere waiting. And then, one night, I woke up to find a note on my bedside table. It was written in a shaky hand, and it simply said, "Thank you." I never found out who put it there or how they got into my house, but I knew, deep down, that it was from Daniel. He had moved on, finally at peace. But I wasn't. I would never be, because now I knew the truth, and the truth was a heavy burden to bear. Some nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I think I can hear his voice, whispering, thanking me for helping him find justice. But it's not a comforting thought. It's a reminder that sometimes the dead don't rest. Sometimes they linger, waiting for someone to listen, to help. And I had listened, but at what cost? The school year ended and I resigned from my job. I couldn't face that classroom anymore, couldn't bear to sit there, knowing what I knew. I moved away to a small town where no one knew me, where I could try to forget. But forgetting isn't easy. Every night I dream of Daniel, his hollow eyes staring at me, his mouth moving in a silent play. I wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, knowing that I will never truly escape what happened. Because the dead don't rest, not really. They leave behind echoes, shadows that cling to the living, refusing to let go. And so I live with my guilt, my regret, knowing that I did what I could, but it wasn't enough. It will never be enough. The nightmares continue, and sometimes I think I see him, standing at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. I don't know what he wants from me. I don't know if he'll ever be satisfied. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget Daniel Harrow. And I'll never stop paying for what I couldn't do. I never thought a simple sketchbook would change my life. I was 12 when I found it in the attic of our old house. It was tucked away in a dusty cardboard box, hidden beneath a pile of old magazines and broken toys. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just an ordinary sketchbook with a leather cover that looked too fancy to belong in our family. But when I opened it, I knew something was different. The pages were blank, but there was something about them that made my fingers tingle. I ran my hand over the smooth surface and felt a strange urge to draw. I'd always liked drawing, but I was never very good at it. My drawings usually ended up looking like weird blobs with too many legs or eyes. But this sketchbook felt different, like it was calling me to try again. So I grabbed a pencil from the old desk in the corner and started sketching. I drew a cat, nothing special, just a simple outline of a cat with pointy ears and a long tail. When I finished, I looked at it and smiled. It was better than most of my drawings. I set the sketchbook aside and went back downstairs, forgetting all about it. That night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a soft scratching noise at my window. I sat up, heart pounding, and peered through the darkness. My room was on the second floor, so there shouldn't have been anything there. But when I looked closer, I saw two glowing eyes staring back at me. I gasped and stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. The cat on the other side of the glass meowed, its voice muffled by the window pane. It was the exact cat I had drawn earlier, down to the curve of its tail and the shape of its ears. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was dreaming, but the cat was still there. It scratched at the window, leaving tiny claw marks on the glass. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing my mind. I went back to the attic, grabbed the sketchbook, and took it to my room. I drew something else, a simple flower this time. I watched, half expecting it to leap off the page and bloom right there in my hand. But nothing happened. I laughed at myself, feeling stupid for being so scared. But that afternoon, when I went out into the backyard, I saw it. A single flower growing in the middle of our lawn, the exact same one I had drawn. I knelt down, touching its petals, my heart racing. This was impossible. Things like this didn't happen in real life. But there it was, swaying gently in the breeze. I ran back inside, my mind spinning with possibilities. What if I could draw anything? What if I could create something amazing? I grabbed the sketchbook and started drawing furiously. I drew a tree, a big one with branches that stretched out wide. Then I ran outside, my breath catching in my throat. It was there. An enormous tree stood in the middle of our backyard, its leaves rustling softly. I couldn't believe it. I had made this. I sat under the tree for hours, drawing more and more things. I drew a swing, and it appeared, hanging from one of the branches. I drew a bird, and it flew down from the sky, landing on my shoulder. I felt like a magician, like I had some kind of superpower. I started drawing things I'd always wanted, a bike, a basketball, even a little dog. They all came to life just like that. I was so caught up in the excitement that I didn't think about what it all meant. I didn't think about what might happen if I drew something by accident. It happened one rainy afternoon. I was bored, stuck inside, doodling in my sketchbook. I wasn't really thinking about what I was drawing, just scribbling shapes and lines. I remember feeling restless, maybe even a little annoyed. And then, without realizing it, I drew something. Terrible. It was a monster, something that came from the darkest corners of my mind. It had sharp claws and teeth that looked like they could tear through anything. Its eyes were hollow and empty, and its body was covered in scales. I stared at the drawing, shivering. It was the kind of thing that gave you nightmares, the kind of thing you'd never want to see in real life. I closed the sketchbook and shoved it under my bed, trying to forget about it. But that night, I heard something outside. A low, guttural growl, like an animal that was hurt or angry. I pulled the covers over my head, praying it was just the wind or a stray dog. But the growling got louder, closer. I crept to the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I peered outside, and there it was, standing in the shadows. The monster I had drawn. It was real, and it was staring up at me with those hollow eyes. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was glued shut. The monster moved closer, its claws scraping against the side of the house. I ran to the sketchbook, my hands shaking, and flipped to the page where I had drawn it. I tried to erase it, to make it disappear, but the pencil marks wouldn't budge. It was like they were carved into the page, like they were meant to stay. The growling got louder, and I knew it was right outside my door. I grabbed the sketchbook and threw it across the room, hoping it would somehow stop the thing from coming in. But it didn't. The door creaked open, and I saw it, standing there, its eyes locked on mine. I don't remember much after that. I think I passed out from sheer terror. When I woke up, the monster was gone. The room was empty, the door closed. I could hear my parents downstairs, talking in hushed voices. I didn't tell them what had happened. They wouldn't believe me. I barely believed it myself, but I knew I had to figure out what was going on. I spent the next few days testing the sketchbook, trying to understand how it worked. I learned that I could only draw things that were simple, things that didn't move or think. Inanimate objects were safe. But living things, especially things that could hurt someone, were dangerous. I had to be careful. I'd also learned that once I drew something, I couldn't erase it. It was permanent, like it was part of the real world now. I tried to draw over the monster, to change it into something else, but it didn't work. The monster was still out there somewhere waiting. I started having nightmares. I would see the monster in my dreams, lurking in the shadows, its hollow eyes staring at me. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, and check the window to make sure it wasn't real. But I knew it was. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on me. I thought about telling someone, but who would believe me? A kid who could draw things to life? It sounded crazy, so I kept it to myself, hoping that the monster would just go away. But it didn't. Every night, I heard it, scratching at the walls, growling softly. It was like it was waiting for something, biding its time. One day, a man came to our house. He was tall and thin, with a long coat and a hat that hid his eyes. He knocked on the door, and when my mom answered, he asked to see me. She looked confused, but she called me down anyway. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring at him. "I hear you have a special talent," he said, his voice smooth and cold. I felt a chill run down my spine. "I don't know what you're talking about," I muttered, gripping the banister. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You can draw things to life, can't you? I've been looking for someone like you." My mom looked between us, her face pale. "What is this about?" The man ignored her, his eyes fixed on me. "I can help you, you know. I can teach you how to control it." I shook my head, backing away. "I don't need your help." He took a step forward, and I felt a surge of fear. "You're making a mistake. There are things out there, things you can't even imagine. If you don't learn to control your gift, they'll find you." I ran back to my room and slammed the door, my heart racing. I didn't know who that man was or how he knew about the sketchbook, but I didn't trust him. I knew I had to be careful. There were people out there who would want to use me, to use my power for something terrible. It was a few weeks later when everything went wrong. I was drawing in the sketchbook, trying to distract myself when I made a mistake. I was sketching a bird, a harmless little sparrow, when my hand slipped. The pencil skidded across the page, and I ended up drawing something else entirely. I don't even know how to describe it. It was like the monster, but worse. Bigger, more dangerous. It had wings and claws, and its eyes were filled with rage. I stared at the drawing, my heart pounding. I knew I had to get rid of it, to tear out the page, but I couldn't move. And then the room grew cold. I felt a gust of wind, and the lights flickered. I looked up, and there it was, hovering in the corner of my room. It was real. I had brought it to life. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out, but I was frozen in place. The creature roared, its wings beating against the walls. It knocked over my lamp, sending it crashing to the floor. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was too loud, too terrifying. I knew I had to do something, anything, to stop it. I grabbed the sketchbook and flipped to the drawing. I scribbled over it, trying to change it to make it go away, but it was no use. The creature shrieked, its eyes locked on me. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like something was squeezing my heart. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, the creature was gone. I was lying on the floor, the sketchbook open beside me. I sat up, my body aching, and looked around. My room was a mess, papers and books scattered everywhere. I felt like I had been hit by a truck. I picked up the sketchbook and stared at the drawing. It was still there, untouched. I knew I had to destroy it, to get rid of it once and for all. I grabbed a pair of scissors and cut out the page, my hands shaking. I tore it into tiny pieces, watching as they fell to the floor. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. The creature was still out there somewhere waiting. I could feel it, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. I knew it was only a matter of time before it came back. I threw the sketchbook into the trash and ran downstairs. My mom was in the kitchen, making dinner. She looked up when I came in, her face worried. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, but I knew I wasn't. I would never be okay again. I had unleashed something terrible, something I couldn't control. And now I had to live with the consequences. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I could hear the creature, its wings beating softly, its growl echoing in the darkness. I knew it was coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. I had made a terrible mistake, and now I was going to pay for it. I had drawn my own nightmare, and it was only a matter of time before it came to life. And then the door creaked open. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I knew what was coming. I never liked working the night shift, but that's the reality of being a nurse. The silence, the darkness, the empty halls, it always made the hospital feel less like a place of healing and more like a tomb. That night started just like any other. I just finished my rounds, checking in on the few patients we had on the floor. Most were sleeping, their steady breathing and the quiet beep of monitors the only sounds that broke the heavy silence. One patient, in particular, had occupied most of my thoughts that day. Mrs. Palmer, an elderly woman who had been with us for a couple of weeks. She had no family left, no one to visit her, and her health had been deteriorating rapidly. That morning, I had found her cold and still, her frail hands folded over her chest. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep. It was always sad when a patient died, but with her, it was different. Maybe it was because she reminded me of my own grandmother, or maybe it was just because she'd been so alone. Either way, it hit me harder than usual. The day shift nurses had taken care of everything, cleaned her up, removed her body, and prepped the room for the next patient. By the time my shift started, it was like she had never been there at all. But I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. I chalked it up to fatigue and tried to brush it off. After all, we see death all the time. You'd think I'd be used to it by now. It must have been around midnight when I first heard it. I was sitting at the nurse's station, sipping on a lukewarm cup of coffee, when a faint voice echoed down the hallway. "Help me." I put my cup down, my heart suddenly pounding. It was so faint, I wasn't even sure I'd heard it. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it came again, a little louder this time. "Help me, please." I stood up, my eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. It seemed to be coming from room 406, Mrs. Palmer's room. I swallowed hard, telling myself that it couldn't be. It must be someone else, maybe one of the other patients. But I had just checked on everyone, and they were all asleep. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing on the polished tiles. The closer I got to room 406, the colder it felt, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. I paused outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was empty, of course. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn back. It was just an ordinary hospital room, except for the cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I stood there for a moment listening. There was nothing but silence. Maybe I really was just hearing things. I shook my head and closed the door behind me, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a shadow. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. That was all. I returned to my station, determined to put it out of my mind. But as the hours dragged on, the voice came again. Faint at first, just a whisper on the edge of hearing. "Help me." I froze, my heart racing. It was unmistakable this time. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back down the hall. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I knew I had to see it for myself. I hesitated outside room 406, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I pushed the door open and shone the flashlight inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the empty bed, the blank walls, the sterile equipment. There was nothing out of place, nothing that could have made that sound. But the cold was back, and this time it was so intense that I could see my breath misting in the air. "Help me." The voice was right behind me now, so close it felt like it was breathing down my neck. I spun around, the flashlight beam jerking wildly as I searched the empty hallway. There was no one there, just the long stretch of silent rooms and darkened doorways. I backed into the room, my heart pounding in my ears. It had to be a prank. Maybe one of the other nurses was trying to scare me, or maybe I was just hearing things. I had been awake for almost 24 hours straight. My mind could be playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The voice was too real, too desperate. By the time morning rolled around, I was a wreck. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every little sound, my nerves stretched tight as piano wire. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd heard. What could I say? That I was hearing voices from an empty room. The next few nights were quiet, almost eerily so. I started to think that maybe I had imagined it all. But then, on the fourth night, it happened again. Help me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the keys from the station and headed straight for the room. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, half expecting to find someone or something waiting for me. But it was just the same empty room, the same cold air. I stood there for a long moment, the keys clutched in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then I saw it, a faint outline on the bed, like the impression of a body lying there. My heart nearly stopped. I reached out a trembling hand, feeling the air above the bed. It was ice cold, and I could swear I felt a slight pressure, like someone was pushing back. I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. I kept seeing that impression on the bed, feeling the cold air on my skin. It was like something was trying to reach out to me to make me understand. I decided to dig into Mrs. Palmer's records to see if there was something, anything, that could explain what was happening. I found her file in the archives, a thick folder filled with medical jargon and case notes. But there was one thing that stood out, a small handwritten note at the bottom of the last page. Patient insists she is not alone in the room. Claims to hear voices calling for help. A chill ran down my spine. Mrs. Palmer had been hearing voices too. Voices calling for help. But there was more. As I flipped through the pages, I found more notes, more patients who had reported hearing the same thing. It went back years, maybe even decades, and they had all stayed in room 406. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just some prank or a figment of my imagination. Something was happening in that room, something terrible. But why? I couldn't let it go. I had to know what had happened in that room. I started asking around, talking to some of the older nurses who had been at the hospital for years. Most of them brushed me off, said it was just a silly superstition. But one, an old woman named Agnes, took me aside and told me the story. It happened years ago, long before I started working there. There was a fire on the 4th floor, a bad one. Most of the patients were evacuated, but one, a young woman, was trapped in room 406. The fire department couldn't get to her in time. She died, screaming for help. They say her spirit never left, Agnes whispered, her eyes wide with fear. That she's still in that room, crying out for someone to save her. I didn't want to believe it, but everything I had seen, everything I had heard, it all made sense. The voice, the cold, the impression on the bed. It was her. She was still there, trapped in that room, calling for help that would never come. I knew I should have left it alone. I should have transferred to another floor, another hospital. But I couldn't. I had to see it through, had to find a way to help her if I could. On my next shift, I brought a candle and a small bouquet of flowers. I don't know what I was expecting to happen, but I hoped it would bring her some peace, maybe help her move on. I lit the candle and set it on the bedside table, the flame flickering in the cold air. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you." For a long time, there was nothing. Just the faint sound of my own breathing, the steady drip of the IV in the next room. And then, so faint I almost missed it, I heard her. "Help me." It was the same voice, the same desperate plea. But this time, it sounded different. Softer, almost sad. "I'm sorry," I said again, tears streaming down my face. "I wish I could help you." The room grew colder, the shadows deeper. The candle flickered and went out. I felt a presence beside me, cold and heavy, like a hand pressing down on my shoulder. I closed my eyes, whispering a prayer under my breath. And then it was gone. The cold, the darkness, everything. The room was just a room again, empty and silent. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe I had helped her in some small way. Maybe she could finally rest. The next few nights were uneventful. The voice didn't come back. The room didn't feel cold anymore. It was like everything had gone back to normal. But then one night, as I was finishing up my rounds, I heard it again. "Help me." I froze, my heart sinking. It was fainter this time, almost like an echo. I followed the sound, my feet moving as if in a trance. It wasn't coming from room 406. It was coming from the room next to it, minus 407. A room that had been empty for weeks. I stood outside the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I knew I shouldn't open it, knew that whatever was inside was beyond my understanding. But I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the air thick and heavy. I could feel something there, something watching me. And then I saw it, a faint outline on the bed, like the impression of a body lying there. Help me. The voice was right behind me, so close it felt like it was inside my head. I spun around, my heart racing. There was no one there, just the empty room, and the darkness pressing in around me. I backed away, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. I kept hearing that voice, kept seeing that impression on the bed. It was like she had never left, like she was still there, still calling for help. And then one day, I found a note in my locker. A single sheet of paper with just 3 words written on it. Help me, please. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't stay there, couldn't keep hearing that voice. But even now, as I sit in my small apartment, I can still hear it, faint and desperate, echoing in the back of my mind. Help me. I don't think she'll ever leave me.